Good afternoon. Welcome to November 25th Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. I'd like to first recognize that we are on the traditional territory of the Sunamo First Nations. Our clerk today is Sky Snellgrove, and the question period sign-up sheet is on the desk by the computers. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding an agenda item, please write down your name and the agenda item on the sheet. At the start of the question period, the chair will call those who have signed up to the podium to address council. So I would assume there is no introduction of late items?
No late items today.
Thank you. And a motion for adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
So moved, Councillor Turley, seconded.
Maybe we should just change chairs.
Seconded, Councillor Bonner.
Second senior.
Or second is Councillor Brown. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion for adoption of minutes as circulated. So moved by Councillor Armstrong, seconded by Councillor Turley. All those in favor? Thank you. For reports, we are moving straight into community wellness and livability and public safety to be introduced by Jake Rudolph.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to quickly turn this over to Mr. Lindsay, who's actually organized this afternoon, and all the participants. But you'll recall the context for this discussion today was sometime this fall, we at a meeting of council at GPC, the discussion around a public safety committee came up, or what, and it was not that long after that big public meeting that it had happened. That was well attended by the community and by council. And so at that time, it was suggested that you have a dedicated afternoon or time for Governance Priorities Committee to sort through this conversation and see where you land. And Mr. Lindsay was gracious to help organize the various departments, and so he'd be the one that sort of takes the lead from this point on, and certainly with our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph. Madam Chair, just a couple words of introduction before I turn it over to the superintendent is, first of all, this is a bit of a group team effort to get in front of you today. And I'll talk a little bit about who you're going to hear from, because they were all important in kind of putting this day together for you. What I want to start off by saying is what today's not. And I think really if we talk about local government, we talk about public safety. So much of what we do is looked at through the lens of public safety, but you've already had separate GPC days on emergency planning. You've heard from Karen Lindsay, so that's not part of the agenda today. There's obviously other things we could include under public safety. Virtually everything we do, our building inspections, our transportation, our infrastructure management, all has a public safety lens. But we're very much today, our understanding was a real focus around what is perceived as crime and public and social disorder issues that are often cited as being related to the opioid epidemic, and that's what we're focusing the agenda on today. Certainly available to take questions on other areas, but that is the focus of the presentation. In terms of, I mentioned there was a group of us that sat around talking about putting this day together, and really through those discussions there's sort of three themes that came out of that we wanted to focus on today. And one is giving you a sense of reality of what it is we're hearing. I know a lot of you are getting contacted regularly by a concerned community, but we want to put some perspective to that in terms of numbers, and the superintendent's going to help us with that in terms of their most recent numbers. We also want to talk, in addition to reality, what is the response, not only the RCMP response, but the response of our organization, and that's across all departments. How has it been responding to these issues? And the last is resiliency. What are we doing as a city, as RCMP, to make sure that we're more resilient moving forward, dealing with this very difficult issue. In terms of the outline today, just to go over it briefly, you're going to hear in just a moment from Superintendent Cameron Miller. After his presentation, I'm very pleased to say that we have Jessica Patterson with us this afternoon. Jessica's the deputy, or Ms. Patterson's the deputy regional crown for Vancouver Island North, and she'll be coming up immediately following Superintendent Miller's presentation. and that will be followed by Mr. Dave LeBerge from Bylaws. Following that, we're going to have a bit of a break, so we're hoping that'll take us from about 1 to 2:15, and then around 2:15 we're proposing a bit of a break, but it's going to be a bit of a working break for you because Chief Fry has her crew coming in, and they're going to give you a little bit of a bystander CPR demonstration for council. So we're hoping you stick around. Training, sorry, not demonstration, training. I think that implies that you're actually doing something. So there's going to be some training, and this is something I would say that virtually all staff through the city have gone through this bystander training, a good program, and we wanted the opportunity to kind of also share that with council. So that'll be about 2:15 to 2:45, so opportunity for that training and a little bit of a break. 2:45, we'll get back together, and we're going to hear from Ms. Lisa Bopulsing on the community planning front. Chief Fry is going to speak following that, and then the end we'll wrap up with Liz Williams from Parks. And then hopefully, through the chair, hopefully there's an opportunity at the end just to leave some of that space for discussion of council around this topic. Certainly happy to take questions throughout the day, but we wanted to leave some time hopefully at the end of the day for that discussion, for you to have that discussion. The last point I wanted to make is certainly we try to be sensitive about not being an overlap to a lot of the other presentations. You've just had presentations from Bylaw GPC Day in just a couple weeks ago. You've got a health and housing task force, which is really touching on many of these similar issues. It's hard not to overlap on their mandate and their issues with what is often perceived as public safety. So we were trying to be at least mindful of that when we're putting this together. So if there's things that are missing or if things that we've not touched on, it's because we believe that we've touched on them elsewhere. So after that really long introduction, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Miller to start us off today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Your Worship, Council. So, as Mr. Lindsay said, my name is Cameron Miller. I'm the OIC of the Nanaimo RCMP. While you all know who I am, just introducing myself for the record. And I'll start off by saying that the mission statement of the Nanaimo RCMP is to make Nanaimo the safest community in Canada. So how we go about doing that is we look at what we have for our policing officers. And this is just to refresh everybody's memory. I did go through some of this at the Finance and Audit Committee, but I will go through it again for the record on this GPC meeting. There are 144 regular members paid for by the City of Nanaimo. That will be rising to 147 on April 1st. There's 63.1 FTE municipal employees and 1 civilian member who's our criminal intelligence analyst. We have 8 provincial police officers. Those are funded wholly by the province, and that's for regional district, Cedar and Lanцeville. And there's 2 federal policing officers, and they do First Nations policing on our 2 First Nations community, and they work in Indigenous files. So a total of 154 regular members with 63.1 municipal employees and 3 public servants. So as I mentioned, that'll be increasing on April 1st, 2020. Now, the Nanaimo RCMP and myself are well aware of varying crime trends. I hear from His Worship, I hear from members of council, emails received from citizens, and I myself are reviewing the statistics basically on a daily basis to see what's in with that on. And one of the things we are, a lot of times in policing, we have 2 options. We are reactive and we are proactive. So some of the proactive things that we're doing right now, 3 programs I just want to talk about. Project 529. We do have a problem with bicycle theft in this city. A lot of times bicycles are not locked up and they go missing. So Project 529 is a program, it's an app, you can download it, and what happens is they register their bikes, and we've gotten bikes back that have been tagged on Project 529. So you can see the numbers there of the number of bikes we have registered. So in 17, we had started off with 487. That doubled in 2018. And right now, year to date, we're at 1,240 as of the end of September. So we're actually hoping to double 2018's number. We're proactive and aggressive in doing this and getting out the community. And one of the places we work hardest at is VIU. Because we understand that a lot of the students at VIU, this is their only form of transport. And when that gets nicked, they're into a big world of hurt. And some of these bikes, as you know, can cost thousands and thousands of dollars. So you can see there the bikes we recovered in 17, 18, and 19. So those numbers are growing up. And we also do things called bait bikes, and we'll cover that off in a moment. Second thing I want to talk about for community policing programs is Block Watch. We have 13,000 participants in the city of Nanaimo, and that's Nanaimo proper alone. 133 active blocks. And what we're doing with this, in addition to those, Lanцeville's got 6 with 500 people, and Cedar has a couple. with 150 participants. So we're just shy of 14,000 people. And what happens is we want to get these people out, and by educating these people on how to protect themselves, how to make themselves less a victim, we try and remove the triangle.
And just one moment, I have a question from Mayor Crow.
Thank you very much. Through you to Superintendent Miller. I'm just looking at the numbers of bikes registered, which is wonderful, very appealing, and then looking at the number of bikes recovered. Does that reflect the fact that they're being chopped in various places and shifted around, or are they being sold out of community? In other words, where do the stolen bikes disappear, so to speak?
Well, a couple places where the bike goes. Number one, some of them are chopped up for scrap metal. There is policies with the scrap metal dealers that they have to account for the metal they're getting. So, there's certain types of metals they can't take. The second thing is a lot of the bikes that get stolen end up at City Works and they're sold for auction. And you might say, well, why is that happening? And I want to ask every member of council, I'm not going to embarrass you by making you put up your hands up, but how many of you have written down the serial number for your bicycle?
Do what?
Oh, okay, well, now you're putting your hands up, you might be embarrassing your colleagues, right? I can't stop that. So. Okay. The majority of bikes that get stolen, people don't have serial numbers on them. And this is why Project 529 has become such a key thing, because you register your serial number at the same time. And what happens is we have volunteers go out, be it on the university, on the E&N trail or wherever, and they'll sit there with an iPad, and they'll go over there, and they'll stop, and they'll say, Mr. Thorpe, do you want to register your bike? It's free. So you find out what the story is, and we get the serial number, and we put it in, it goes live at that point. And then we put a sticker on it, and those stickers are basically almost impossible to remove. So when his bike gets stolen, he calls up, he says, hey, my name is Ian Thorpe, somebody nicked my bike. And what happens then, so we pull up his details, yep, okay, we got your bike, and the serial number is ABC123. We put that on the system, and then if anybody else sees it or tries to sell it, there's a 529 sticker on it. And that's how we're getting back more and more bikes. And this is a worldwide program. So that answer your question,
Thank you.
Madam Chair? Good with that?
Thank you.
Okay. So I think I covered off Block Watch. I also want to cover off community policing volunteers. So our volunteers, as I mentioned before, myself and the 154 sworn officers in this city can't do it on our own. So we need members of the community to be our eyes and ears and also to help out. And there's a lot of people in this town that have time and energy and want to make this a better place because this is our home. Some of the things we get them to do and work with them on: speed watch, distracted driving, Crime Watch, Project 529 as I mentioned, and doing different community events. And you might ask, community events such as Canada Day, VIX, the parades, and stuff like that, going into schools and sometimes helping out and handing out things. Just before Halloween, a number of our volunteers went out to Woodgrove Mall, and they handed out over 3,000 pieces of reflective tape. So that's reflective triangles, reflective armbands and wristbands from TELUS and from ICBC, our partners. And we're doing that in an effort to make pedestrians more visible and to reduce the number of injuries we have. So we get our volunteers to go out and do that. The number of hours spent, you can see there that it's growing, went up from 17 to 18, went up dramatically from 18 to 19. And the number of volunteers we had, in 2017, we only had 20 volunteers, and that just jumped to 22 in 2018. It jumped to 32 in 2019, because in 2017, our volunteer coordinator left, and the position was vacant for 6 months while we tried to fill it. We now have a volunteer coordinator, a very, very dedicated man, Dave Couson, a former RCMP officer, connects really well with the volunteers in the community. And in addition to the 32 there, he's interviewing right now 10 volunteers. He's completed the interviews, for 10 volunteers, and their files are going forward to security. So, we might be upping that up close to 40. In addition to the volunteers, he's interviewed 5 auxiliary constables who are also taking part in these sort of programs and helping out the community as well. So that's just some of the things we're doing proactive.
We have a question from Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Superintendent Miller. The Crime Watch program, there's been a lot of talk on Facebook about trying to revive Citizens on Patrol. Can you speak to that and see if the Crime Watch program is filling that void? Or?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Councillor Armstrong, to Madam Chair. So the RCMP a few years ago decided to go with a homogenous program for community volunteering and Crime Watch. So what happened is Citizen on Patrol was more of a silo thing. Crime Watch, all our volunteers are trained in multiple aspects and they can do multiple things is one of the reasons. Second reason is when our Crime Watch volunteers go out, they go out in a vehicle that's owned by the City of Nanaimo and it says Community Volunteers City of Nanaimo. So what happens is A lot of times during the day, you might pass a police car that's an unmarked car, so you wouldn't know it's a police car. But if you see a big white and blue police car going back with lights on it, that's a police car. When people go around the community and they see citizens on patrol, or pardon me, not citizens on patrol, but RCMP Crime Watch, that vehicle is marked out and present, and people are saying, okay, the police are looking, or people connected to the police. In addition, when the Crime Watch people go out, before they head out, they check in with the watch commander on duty. The watch commander then knows where they're going, and he can tell them, stay out of this area because there's police operations going on, or can you patrol a certain area for us because we've had troubles. And an example would be on a Friday Thanksgiving weekend in 2018 Rutherford School. So the Crime Watch volunteers came on, and the watch commander said, can you go patrol around Rutherford School? Don't go into what we call the hot zone, but go around the areas. And we want to know if anything's brewing, if there was reports of vigilantism going to take place on Facebook and whatnot. So we wanted to know if there's groups of people marauding down the street with signs, and the Crime Watch volunteers could say, hey, we're seeing this, and that could be our extra eyes and ears. So the RCMP as a whole within British Columbia is elected to go with the Crime Watch as a whole homogeneous program. And that's the direction that the Nanaimo Detachment is following in conjunction with our command.
And one follow-up, just so the citizens do know, I believe it was 2016, I think it was, there was only 33 block watch, so congratulations to Constable O'Brien for all the work he's done, and to the citizens for taking them up on that, because that's a very impressive number compared to where we were at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as I mentioned earlier, I regularly look at the statistics. I talk to my management team, and we try and find out what's going on. We are proactive in a number of areas, but in a number of areas we have to be reactive. Question? Or?
Nope.
Okay. So what we do and what we looked at, we saw a spike in property crime. Now, this is not a Nanaimo phenomena. This is a province-wide, and this is actually a nationwide phenomena. And you may have seen a recent article in Maclean's that talked about property crime and where it's up, and that loops into the Crime Severity Index, and I forwarded the Council Crime Severity Index numbers in July when they were published by Statistics Canada. But what I did earlier this year is I revived a program, what we call Crime Reduction Unit, so our CRU. And what I did is I profiled some resources that were in general duty, those are your first response people, and I took them aside for a 2-month period, and I let them focus strictly on crime reduction in some areas that we call hotspots where we're seeing the map being painted red. And what I'd like to introduce now is my friend and colleague, Sergeant Nick Armstrong, and I asked Sergeant Armstrong to be the head of the Crime Reduction Unit. I'm going to ask Nick to talk about the CRU, some of their statistics and some of the things, because he was the man that ran this team both in the spring and the fall. And I think, or I hope you'll agree with me after he talks, that you'll see that Sergeant Armstrong has an incredible passion for crime reduction. Nick?
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Your Worship and Council, thank you for allowing me to speak with you here today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm in my 16th year here, and my second tour in our wonderful city. Back in 2008 and 2009, I was one of the originating members of our previous crime reduction unit and really led that throughout the island and helped other detachments north to south of the island create their own units. As we all know, there was a spike in certain crime areas, and Superintendent Miller approached me to see if we could implement some of these more modern crime reduction strategies in a more focused manner than we have done in the past to try and get a handle on some things that had taken place. We ran 2 initiatives. The first was in April and May of 2019, and the second one just finished this previous Friday, the 22nd of November, which also ran for an additional 8 weeks. During that time, we had some really great success. It was not unexpected, I should say, because of the type of work that we're doing. We allocated, as Superintendent Miller said, 4 resources, 1 from each of our general duty watches, and refocused their decision-making and their day-to-day activities on areas and types of offenses which would historically cause multiple calls for service. The long-term goal of a fully functioning and adequate crime reduction unit is to reduce the number of calls that are being received by targeting those offenders that are causing the highest level of repetition in our city. Some of the better sort of numbers that we're looking at, and they were all wonderful, we created what we would consider 755 additional files. So yes, that increases the file count, if you will. However, because of those increased files, we then have offenders that are remanded into custody, receive jail sentences, and thusly the output is a lower number down the line. During this time, there was 236 criminal arrests, with 120 arrest warrants executed. We took on 58 additional curfew checks. Now, this is not something that is specific to the Crime Reduction Unit. On a daily basis, general duty watches 7 days a week are given a list of persons whom are on curfews. That program is also managed through my unit. Some of the more impressive things are during this 16-week period, this group of 4 incredibly motivated individuals were able to put forward 191 recommended criminal charges. Now, obviously, we cannot arrest ourselves out of a crime problem. Everybody knows that. This is a social issue, but we are just one cog in this watch that helps move this thing forward. There was also 543 non-criminal code offenses cited. That would be a collection of violation tickets under the Motor Vehicle Act, bylaws, various statutes, both provincially and locally, that we would have handed out to focus on reasons for a stop and progressing from a legally sound starting point to the end of conclusion of a file. And one such case study, and this is just one example, that would come place because you have a dedicated unit that is able to take the time to do these things. A specific member on the unit was on patrol in the area that we designated in the downtown core very recently. There was a gentleman who had an outstanding warrant. This particular warrant had been outstanding for a number of weeks. This person just happened to not come into contact with any of our other officers. This particular member is very good at recognizing this person. This followed a lawful arrest to execute this warrant that was outstanding. As a result of the search, which occurred incidental to his arrest, there was a large quantity of drugs, cash, scales, and other materials or paraphernalia that we would link to what we would consider being in possession of those drugs, fentanyl, for example, and methamphetamine, for the purposes of trafficking. This resulted in a large sum of drugs being seized, cash, and of course, federal charges that were pushed forward.
I have a question. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Sergeant Armstrong, for all your work. Great job by all. We often hear from people in the community that a lot of these people aren't from Nanaimo. Can you comment, have you seen an increase in transitory people, or are they established Nanaimoites?
Thank you, Councillor. We are seeing both, yes, absolutely. I believe that it's the nature of being a hub city here on Vancouver Island. We are very central. We have almost every sort of social and economic resource that a person whom is down on their luck may need to try and turn things around when they've had a bad go. So yes, we certainly see lots of people that are transient in nature, that are not from here. I don't have the specific numbers, but I would say from my experience, the vast majority are local Nanaimo folks, with a smaller percentage coming from outlying communities and in cases from other areas of the province and the country.
Thank you.
I don't know that we have much more to say about that. This is an initiative that we did to kind of give us a sense of what this means and where we might go. And I believe Superintendent Miller is going to talk about it again. We have a criminology student who is coming into our detachment in the coming weeks to do a more in-depth study on crime reduction mandates, proactive policing methods, to provide what he can in a thesis type statement to help explain better what the long-term projections or goals of a fully functioning, properly staffed crime reduction unit can do for our wonderful city.
Thank you. I have a question from Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to our presenter. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but my documents of this presentation that I got Friday, the numbers are much lower than yours here. So either a whole bunch happened over the weekend, Or you guys might be using a different time frame?
Yes, so I believe the first draft that council would have received was compiled late in the day on Wednesday. Our unit continued to run through to the end of business on Friday. The numbers which were on the screen and which were presented to you were the ones at the end of the initiative on the 22nd. I believe the initial draft was sent out roughly 48 hours before.
Wow, you're busy.
To say there is a lack of work is not the case.
Yeah.
We just need the proper people and the resourcing to make that happen.
Thank you. It's not working. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. Through you to the presenter. Why only 8 weeks in length, each one? If we know that the CRU is doing a great job, which your numbers show it is, why wouldn't we just keep it going?
That's a very good question, Councillor. And I can't speak to the overall operational decision-making for our detachment. We have, like everyone, we have resourcing struggles. That is not unique to us, that is certainly a problem for all of our community partners. The OIC, and through the discussions with his watch commanders, we selected times that would be advantageous for our detachment, that would allow a reduction in the number of resources on the general duty watches, so as to not necessarily impact our response time, which is why we did them in the spring and in the fall versus the summer. This was a lot of the decision-making on the timing and the length of time. The purpose of these initiatives is not to instill a long-standing change. In order to see the true effectiveness of a crime reduction focused unit, you're looking at 18, 24 months of consistent work. What we were looking to do is to say, during this period of time, do we have an opportunity to focus on an area or a crime type that is causing all of us grief? And so Superintendent Miller, I think very smartly selected times of the year and the membership that were assigned to our unit that did just that. They worked hard, many hours of overtime every single day, ensuring that their files were done correctly and focusing on what we needed them to focus on to give us a picture of, yes, if we had what we needed to do, this is something that we could turn into something really great once again. But I don't think I can answer why it's not all the time.
Thank you. And we have Councillor Gesselbach.
Thank you. Just looking up some statistics there. Thank you.
Oh, I turned him off.
Chair Marvin, I guess that was just following up. Say, for example, if we'd identify that this crime reduction unit is something that we'd like more consistently, I mean, is it something that is possible with the new officers coming on board, or is it we require, significant extra funding for a long-term project?
One more.
I was going to say, I don't know that that's necessarily for myself.
Yeah, I think probably for
Superintendent Miller can step in on that one.
Superintendent Miller.
Yeah, Madam Chair, through you to the Councillor Gesselbrecht. So a couple of things. Is this something we could do with the new resources? We've put them in a different area right now. One of the things that we also have to consider with this crime reduction unit, when I put the call out for individuals to take part in this, there's a couple of criteria that we need them to meet. One of the criteria was they had to be available for the full 2 months. That meant no court commitments, no leave. And when you take an office with a bunch of people in it, you know that at any given time you're going to have some people on vacation, some people on leave, some people doing courses and training. And I think, Nick, if I'm right, everybody was basically had to be there the full 2 months. So you've got a dedicated squad that's working full time. Much like if you have a contractor and he comes in and does the job, they come for that entire time. But you can think of yourselves. There's council meetings here where I don't see the full 9 councillors there because somebody's on vacation, somebody's on leave or whatever. So that was one of the things that we looked at with the crew. With, back to the substantive question of where the new resources are going, we're looking at putting one as a criminal and intel analyst, because all crime can be predicted. You know where it's going to happen. So you look at your past trends, and what's the only thing about history? It repeats itself. So we know where it's going. So we want to make sure that we target the resources in the right sort of areas. The third thing we're looking at is that Nick mentioned, we're getting a criminology student in from VIU, and this student will write a thesis on what the crime reduction unit did, the statistics before and the statistics after. Because what we're looking for is the rate of recidivism. Is the crime reduction unit having a long-term impact on it? Is it having a short-term impact? Because when you go out and play a game called whack-a-mole, you knock them down for a bit. And at times, the criminal element in this community, who some of them we have relationships with, and we'll be able to talk to them, and they know who we are, we know who they are. And at times they'll say to us, are you guys running another crew? Because a crime reduction unit, because we're seeing you guys all over the place, and they get scared and they go to ground for a bit. Then we take the people off. Another reason why I've stood crew down now at the end of November, going into the Christmas season, is mental health and wellness of my officers. Because I've taken these 4 officers off general duty from their substantive watches and put them in the crime reduction unit. Well, during that time, their watches is 1 member short. And we have minimums that we have to meet for policing standards and officer safety, public safety. So now that I've put another member back on the road, I've increased the watch capacity, which allows people to take time off at Christmas. It allowed people to take time off in the summer with the spring one, because mental health is a key component of the RCMP and my personal thing for the detachment, because I want to make sure everybody's looked after, because sometimes people get to the point where they have to take a knee. And I want to make sure they've got enough resources, they get back up, and they can take time off when they need to come back refreshed and recharged. So that's a whole bunch of thought processes that go into the CRU of why it was stood up, why we took it down. We want to look at the numbers and look going forward. Is it possible that we'll stand up a full-time crew? Absolutely. We're going to take a look at what we get from this student. We're going to look at our numbers ourselves. I'm going to meet with my NCOs like Nick and his boss, with Inspector Fletcher, Inspector Paddock, and we'll talk about it and we'll figure out what is the best thing to provide public safety to this community.
Thank you. And we have Councillor Armstrong.
Just refers you to Superintendent Miller, just to follow up on that. I was here when the initial crew was here, and I think Nick was on it at the time, and it was extremely successful, and then obviously changes were made by a previous OIC, in my opinion, to our detriment, but that's just my opinion. Are you going to be looking at, when you say you're looking at the stats, are you going to compare to the stats today? I mean, we've got a huge increase in homelessness, which is going to increase. So I don't know how you can really, or how are you going to be able to compare that accurately to see if a full-time unit is just as effective as a part-time? I mean, I understand it's great that you've done the part-time. Obviously, I lean towards full-time, but not my decision. But are you going to be able to address that?
Yeah, thank you. So, Madam Chair, to Councillor Armstrong. So one of the things we'll look at, and I'll have my criminal intel analyst do this because she's a specialist, obviously, of that. We'll look at what the numbers were just before we formed the crime reduction unit, what the numbers were at the end of the crime reduction unit, because there's your delta between, starting point and ending point, and then we'll look a couple months after the end of the crime reduction unit. So if we see your typical sine curve going up and down and up, we know that the crime reduction unit is very effective in that time period. If we see the sine curve and then coming down on a straight line, we know, and then stays down, maybe the crime reduction unit did the thing for long term. So we'll be looking at stats in today's present environment. We do know that the stats from 2016, when we had about 350 homeless, may not be the same as now with between 600 and 700 homeless. So we do know that that's an issue. But I do really want to stress this fact, that homeless people do not necessarily commit crime, and homelessness is not a crime. So we don't focus on the homeless people, we focus on the area where we are seeing crime.
And just a follow-up, please. On that, are you also going to be tracking how much time those individuals served, if they did serve any? Will that be part of the study to show that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Will you be looking at the if they're convicted, will you be looking at the sentencing that was given? Like, I mean, that's obviously going to have a huge impact whether they got a day's jail time, 0 jail time. I mean, that's something we hear constantly, the revolving doors of the judicial system. The impact it does have on officers becoming, depressed, like what's the point of doing it when I arrested the same guy 5 times this week. Are you going to be looking at that impact?
Yeah, sure. So, Madam Chair, to Councillor Armstrong, thank you for that question. So, as an officer of the court, I'm very cognizant of what the courts do, what the bench does, and we present our evidence to the court. It's there at that point, it's up to the learned judge to make a decision on the finding of guilt, and based on that, a finding of what any sort of sentencing may be. My friend and colleague, Ms. Jessica Patterson, will be coming after me, and she'll talk more about Crown, what the role of Crown is, and she'll be able to speak more on sentencing. But as an officer of the court, my job is just to present evidence to the court.
Thank you.
So a couple of things I want to talk about now going forward with policing that people may not know a lot about, and what kind of time do we spend on calls, and how come officers aren't out there 24/7, 365 racing around? Because when you get dispatched to a call, there's a lot of things you've got to do. And if you look at the picture on the far left, 35 to 40 minutes, that's spent contacting the complainant. So the file comes in and gets dispatched. You've got to process and write up the initial stuff. You have to do a bit of investigation, maybe knock on the neighbor's door, find out what's going on. You have to update the complainant. That's one of the things we're really big on, and that's part of one of our overall detachment objectives. And myself, I take it very personally that we update our complainants, because when something happens and you go out and you talk to the police and they disappear, you never hear from them again, you don't know what happened. So the officer might come back and say, hey, we don't have any suspects, or we found this suspect, or this is what's happened. And something our officers are always going to do is talk to you, if you're a victim of crime, saying, hey, maybe you could target harden yourself, maybe you could become less of a victim of a crime if you do these certain things. So that's about your first 30 to 45 minutes. Your middle one there, this is a little bit of a more complicated file. Let's say you have a domestic or a sexual assault or something, and if you look at the one on the far left where the 45 is, you've got to arrest your suspect. Then you've got to process the file and submit recommend charges to Crown. Crown will then make the decision if they're going to approve charges or not. My friend and colleague Jessica will cover that off shortly. You're attending the scene. You might have to attend multiple scenes. You're going to assist the victim. And a lot of times the victims just want to talk to somebody. And this is where we can engage victim services, because victim services can provide them a lot of information on what the court process is all about. Well, we can do that. What happens if we do that? It takes us off the road. So we assist the victim in that way. Do this person need medical attention? Are they transported to NRGH? If they're transported to NRGH and we have to seize specimens, or we have to seize samples, blood or whatever, we have to stay with that person. That keeps an officer off the road while they're staying at the hospital with the person. Taking statements, creating a safety plan. In the case of a domestic violence, which is one of our priorities that the council gave for me in 2019-20, was, domestic violence. So we want to make sure that Mrs. Victim does not become a victim again, how she can create a safety plan, working with partners within the community. On the far right, the 45 to 75 minutes, a smaller file, for example, let's say a drunk in a public place. So we go downtown and we find somebody at Friday night at 3 o'clock in the morning, singing songs at the top of their lungs, making no sense, standing in the rain in the middle of the road. Well, obviously they're a danger to themselves. We've got to go pick them up, we've got to transport them to cells, we've got to book them into cells, we've got to write the paperwork up and make sure that they have their charter rights. Back to the box in the middle. Like I say, that's 45 minutes to multiple days, because if you get a serious sexual assault, a serious assault causing bodily harm, and think back to the file in May of this year when we had a First Nations Indigenous lady sleeping on a park bench. She was attacked by a random stranger and stabbed multiple times. All right, that file is still ongoing through the courts now. So we still have officers working on that one. Homicides will take years before they come to court. Fatal accidents take a long time. So, the shortest file, maybe 45 minutes from start to finish to write up. The longest ones are going on, and we still have a few cold case homicides that we're working on actively. So that's what a lot of our officers' time is spent on. In addition to that, we have to keep our members trained. The top box there is firearms training. Firearms are something that every officer hopes that they never have to use. However, in the event that it comes to, we have to make those sort of decisions, we have to be trained on it. 3 days every year are spent on annual requalifications and certifications, and there's a few courses that you take one time after you get out of the academy, whether it's carbine, which is our rifles, or shotguns, or conducted energy weapon stuff. Our middle one, public and police safety training, and that sort of stuff, we're using our CEWs, our operational skills, trauma equipment training. Most of the officers now carry trauma kits in the event of a massive hemorrhaging or one of their colleagues is shot. How you pack that wound to get them in order for our ambulance colleagues to take them back. That's 4 days every year and 5 days once every 3 years. You've got some online courses that are mandated, such as EVO, Emergency Vehicle Operation, 30 to 40 hours. And then different investigators will go on different courses, much like continuing education, which lawyers will take, which accountants, anybody in public practice. So really you're looking at 10 to 15 days a year that the officers are off the road getting training. That's 10 to 15 days every year. And that's for our continuing education to stay current. So that's another thing that takes up a lot of our time. Talk about violation tickets now. You can see the chart there, so the only number we put up there is the number of the year that had the most stats on that. Obviously, I have the numbers for the other years, but 6755 stats. Now, in 2016, you'll see the numbers fairly low. It was 5,080 that year. That's the year I had 11 fatals in this town. And a fatal accident takes a long time to write up, and it pulls the traffic members off the road. Therefore, there's less opportunity to write tickets and do positive enforcement such as that way. We want to talk about motor vehicle accidents. There's 53 controlled intersections in Nanaimo, so that's where you have traffic lights. All right, now the majority of these accidents, unfortunately, are going to happen in controlled intersections. Put your hand up if you haven't seen somebody run a yellow light today. Yeah, didn't think so, all right? But that's what's happening, right? Everybody's in a rush and you're causing a lot of accidents. And unfortunately, a number of these accidents are fatal accidents. We've had, I believe, 9 year to date. Last year we had 7, year before 7, year before that 11. So we want to work with our partners in ICBC to getting those down. Another thing that's kind of distressing is alcohol and drug roadside suspensions. So in 2016, we averaged about 1 a day. 2018, we're averaging about 5.5 a week. So that is trending in the right direction, but that's still too high. Everybody has the right to get home safely, and we're working with our partners to make sure that people know to keep the public safe, because when people think of public safety right now, they're thinking about homeless people walking around their community and break-ins. But if you knew that 11 people were being killed in the community every year, people would be outraged. But that's happening on the roads. That, to me, is a huge problem, which is why I focus a lot of energy, time, and resources on traffic safety. Talk about our crime statistics with respect to property crime. It's fairly self-explanatory. There's a 28% increase from 2018 to 2015. We had almost 7,900 property crimes in 2018. The number is trending up again this year. And I stopped at 2018 because I wanted to give full years because it's more accurate. And you can see violent crime is also trending up. That's a sign of our community as well. And we did find that in the homeless camp, especially down at One Port Place, a lot of people there were in the end carrying knives and different weapons, and they were assaulting each other. So that was a portion of the spike in 2018. And I think you may have seen our numbers for 2019 in violent crime is actually trending down, which is a positive thing. Just to break down the property crime a little bit more, B&Es, break and enters, up 7%, fraud up 95%. But, fraud, go from about 300, 400, 640, so those numbers overall are low. I don't understand why people don't hang up on the Nigerian prince that calls and asks them to send money. I'm still perplexed at that. I'm not going to send them any money, but that's just me. Theft from motor vehicle, that's killing us. Lock your cars. There's a number of areas where we know we're getting hit hard, and we do patrols in those areas. But I've mentioned before the crime triangle, where you have a suspect, victim, and opportunity. Take away the opportunity, the triangle collapses. So that's one of the things we want to do, work on with the community on that one. I mentioned earlier bike theft, up 11% from 15 to 18. And as I mentioned, these bikes a lot of times the only way people have to get around. Shoplifting, working with our loss prevention officers to keep police officers out of the stores working on this so LPOs can do this. Possession of stolen property, once again, Nick and his street crew doing a lot of that stuff. Theft from the malls, you can see that. It's a easy target. People will go in, and a lot of times you'll see different merchants have a security guard standing at the front. A lot of times you'll see banks have security guards in there. Because, John Dillinger once was asked, why do you rob banks? John Dillinger said that's where they keep the money. So, that's where people go for the mall because they know the goods are to steal. Our violent crimes, we covered off the global thing, but one of the disturbing trends on here, your second statistic, assaults on police officers, up 43% from 15 to 18. Yesterday I got an email and I talked to one of my officers who went to arrest somebody who was in a drug-induced psychosis. This individual turned on him, started attacking her. We took her off the road for the rest of the day. She's shaken up. She's back on the road tonight. She said she's feeling okay. I spoke with her. But once again, our officers aren't punching bags. And I've discussed with my friend and colleague, Ms. Patterson from Crown, how important that is to me. And whenever Crown gets one of these assault against PO, they always discuss it with the officer before they go forward on any sort of charges. Other criminal code stuff, we're looking at indecent acts, exposing child pornography. I've mentioned that. That's another one that takes a ton of time. In 2 methods. Number 1, to pull all the stuff out of computers. Number 2, officer wellness, because I'm making sure my officers that deal with that stuff are seeing psychologists, because that is not something that normal people want to see or do. Weapons violations are down. Obstruct PO is fairly neutral. Trespass at night, which is kind of a curious one that you see, is down 61% from 15 to 18. With all the stuff I hear about homeless people walking around, I think the trespass by night would be up, and prowlers. But it's not, which is why we encourage people along the signs of the airport, see something, say something. We want people to call in and tell us. We've broken through 47,000 files for the year. We're probably going to ballpark around 52,000 files for the year, up from 48,000 last year. We want the people to call, because if I want to predict where crime is through my analyst, I have to know when things are going on.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
Just a question on the trespass at night. Would that be because maybe some of the calls are resulting in theft instead, so it's scored differently?
So it is possible if somebody calls in for a prowler and we go and we see Mr. Prowler running around and he's running with a chainsaw in his backpack that probably shouldn't belong to him, that could end up being a theft file. If we don't find anybody, it could be just scored as a prowler filing. Every case would be on a different thing.
But what if there was actually like entry to the house, so that would be a different thing, even though they originally call it in as trespass?
So if it was called, we found somebody who was a breaking in, being in progress or something, then that would be
No,
scored
not in
different.
progress, it's that it happened.
Okay,
It comes in as a trespass, and then when they arrive on scene, they find out, oh yeah, the car had been gone through. So that would be changed, would that not be changed to a theft?
absolutely, it would be changed, it would be scored. And what we do when we score our crimes, Madam Chair, is we score it as the highest level possible. So what might have been called in as a prowler could turn out to be break and enter, theft from motor vehicle, or something at a higher level. If
So
it
that's
was-
maybe why the thefts are up and they're not just prowlers.
It could be, or perhaps people are calling in people when they see, maybe they become acclimatized to it.
That's true.
I can't
Thank
answer
you.
that.
Thank you.
So moving forward in the presentation now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Ms. Jessica Patterson. She's our Deputy Regional Crown. She's with the British Columbia Prosecution Services, and she's going to give you a presentation on the role of Crown Counsel and what they do and how we work with Crown Counsel. So I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you very much.
Is this forward? Thanks. I do apologize, Madam Chair, Your Worship and Council. I'm recovering from this cold that seems to be going around, and it's infected a good chunk of our office here in Nanaimo. So I hope you can hear me, and I apologize if I have to take some water breaks. As you can see, I prepared some slides for you today. You have those. I suspect for most of you it will be a pretty high-level review of stuff you already know about the role of Crown. But I am pleased to be here and try to provide you some annotations to that in person. There's clearly a nexus between the criminal justice process and public safety, which I understand is your focus for today. But the role of Crown, of course, is a specific one in that criminal justice process. It's governed a lot by policy and, of course, requires adherence to the criminal code. And it's, of course, not municipal. So because of that, I'm hoping to provide you a little bit of context for what we do and a bit of an intro to our role, policies, and process in the hopes that it assists your conversation in how to address public safety. So my name is Jessica Patterson. I'm the Deputy Regional Crown for the North Island. That means I oversee all prosecutions by the provincial government from Nanaimo to Port Hardy and Powell River. So that's my area that I cover. Your focus, of course, is Nanaimo. Here in Nanaimo is where I'm located. We have a Crown Counsel office here that has about 11 or 12 Crown, just about two paralegals. They're on their way into our office soon, and 7 administrative staff. Now, as you can expect, we have our work cut out for us, given what you've heard from Superintendent Miller as to the amount of files that flow into our office. And I hate to break it to you, but you may have heard about the provincial budgetary constraints of late, and those numbers are unlikely to go up. I don't have a crystal ball, but that's what it would say, I suspect. So in terms of what we do, we're provincial crowned, so that means that we deal with all offenses and appeals under the Criminal Code of Canada, as well as provincial regulatory offenses, including the Motor Vehicle Act, which is a good chunk of our regulatory work. We do not deal with the federal prosecutions, which include which are offenses under other federal legislation. Mostly drugs is the vast majority of their work. I spent a long time as federal crown, and I'm now with the province dealing with what I think are somewhat more interesting issues. There is some concurrent areas of jurisdiction between the feds and the province that I'm not going to bore you with today. But what should be clear to you is the bulk of our work is under the Criminal Code of Canada, and then some of the regulatory provincial offenses. We do not do bylaws. Those are not enforced by either the federal or the provincial crown. Here in Nanaimo, the federal work, the drug work, is dealt with by an agent firm called Jones and Company that do that work as an agent for the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. So as you might guess, investigations by Superintendent Miller and his crew can lead to both federal and provincial charges arising out of one investigation. When that happens, whichever of the two governments, feds or the provinces, have the most serious charges arising from that investigation, take conduct of the prosecution or the charge assessment, prosecution, and all the processes of the prosecution, which we'll talk about a little bit today. Of course, please feel free to interrupt with questions. You seem perfectly comfortable doing so. I'm happy to take them. I can't promise I'll be able to provide all your answers, but feel free to stop me if I'm going too fast also.
Thank you.
As you no doubt know, the BC Prosecution Service is part of the government, but separate. We're not a silo, but we're independent. Our head is the Assistant Deputy Attorney General, now currently Peter Juck. He's the head of the BC Prosecution Service and supervises all criminal prosecutions by the provincial government in the province. And we act in court as agents for the Attorney General, but we do stand independent from the Attorney General. All of our functions and responsibilities are laid out in the Crown Counsel Act, and it defines our role. Here, we, of course, are not siloed, as I said. We meet regularly with other justice system partners, including corrections, community corrections, and most importantly, probably the RCMP. Here in Nanaimo, we meet approximately monthly with the RCMP to discuss things like priorities, which you've heard about a lot, including their statistics and their crew, projects, and also file-specific matters, to make sure that we can have an open forum to discuss issues that either of the two agencies are having. So our ADEG, Peter Juck, is located in Victoria, so I am currently the senior crown on the North Island, so unfortunately the buck stops with me in a lot of circumstances. This slide is one you're going to see a few times in this presentation. It's just a high-level overview of the criminal justice process, so I'll keep coming back to it as an anchor. And I'd like to walk you through charge assessment, prosecution, and sentencing. For today, we're going to ignore appeals, because the heart of what we do is really those three aspects. And probably the sentencing portion and the charge assessment portion are the ones you're most concerned about in terms of a public safety focus. So, as you know, we don't investigate as Crown. We receive our files for referral from the RCMP here in Nanaimo. In other places, there's of course other municipal detachments like the Vancouver Police Department, like the Vancouver Police Department. So we are responsive to what comes in the door, essentially, as opposed to actively seeking out work. We certainly don't need to do that. So we don't direct what the RCMP investigate, but when we receive a report to Crown Counsel, we deal with it according to our policies and processes. And we do so in a very specific manner. Excuse me. So the charge assessment process is something that's somewhat unique to BC. There are 3 provinces in the country that have a charge assessment process whereby the Crown decide what charges should be laid as opposed to the police laying charges and the Crown reviewing them afterwards. There are merits to both systems. That was reviewed actually extensively in what's called the McQuaig report in 2012, and that's available online and is interesting if you have any interest in that area. But it is what it is, and we're stuck with charge assessment for better or worse. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So charge assessment is the mechanism by which a person charges are laid against a person. We as Crown decide what charges, how many people, how many charges should be laid. We can also use other mechanisms to deal with charges that are forwarded to us for consideration, particularly alt measures. So we can send files for diversion either before the charges are laid or sometime after if we receive information that means that those files meet our policies for sending it to diversion. Our policy Alt1, in fact, all our policies are available online. You're welcome to review them. Some of them are pretty dry. But Alt1 is our one that pertains to alternative measures for adult offenders, and it's the guidelines by which we decide whether a matter should be diverted from the court process. So that speaks a lot to that we should be considering alt measures in all circumstances where it's appropriate.
Thank you. Councillor Hammond.
Thank you. Through you to the delegation. Would alt measures include things like restorative justice?
Thank you for the question through Madam Chair to Councillor Hemmens. Yes, that can be one aspect of an alternative measures. For youth, we call it extrajudicial measures, or the Youth Criminal Justice Act does. But restorative justice is something, the way we use it tends to be a bigger picture use of that term. And in fact, any sentence or diversion program can have a restorative justice component to it. So restorative justice generally we think of when we use it as a way in which the offender is brought into contact with the community to talk about and deal with the impact that the offender had on the community. And that can happen through an alternative measures program, but it can also happen through, say, a probation order or other community supervision requirements. But yes, that's the hope, is that there can be some restoration of that relationship between the offender and the community, whether it's before the criminal justice system is invoked or during or at the conclusion of a sentencing.
Okay, thank you. I might have another question about that, but I'll let you get through this slide.
Thank you. So this, to decide whether a charge should be laid, we assess whether there is a substantial likelihood of conviction and whether a prosecution is required in the public interest. And our policy, CHA1, speaks to that test. That test also applies throughout the prosecution. So if we come into new information or new evidence that changes our assessment of one of those two standards, then we have to reassess the file, and that can often lead to a stay of proceedings or other termination of the proceeding. Continuing with charge assessment briefly, I just wanted to flesh out a little bit about what substantial likelihood of conviction means. So what is required in assessing substantial likelihood of conviction is a full review of all of the evidence obtained by the police and provided to us. We review it and assess whether, based on that evidence, what of it is admissible, how strong it is, whether a charge can be laid. Of course, if a charge is laid, all of that material needs to then be disclosed to the accused person so that they can mount an answer in defense if they so choose to do so. That process of assessing a substantial likelihood of conviction is what gives rise to some back and forth often between us and the RCMP in terms of requiring follow-up investigation, ensuring we have the full picture of what happened. So I just want to read to you really quickly one quote from the McQuaig report that I referred to earlier. Our criminal justice system is not an inquiry into truth. It is not about whether an accused actually committed a crime, but whether there is sufficient evidence to prove that he committed it. To put it simply, it's not about whether an accused did it, but whether the Crown can prove it. And that is an unfortunately painfully true reality when we're assessing substantial likelihood of conviction. There can be a large amount of evidence that suggests that the person probably did what it is that we're being asked to charge them for, but if we don't have admissible evidence to prove it, we simply can't proceed. The second standard, public interest, requires...
Sorry, excuse me, Councillor Bonner.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll call you Your Worship, but well, I'm sure you are. Thank you through to our presentation. This concept here, and I'm not being irrelevant or like I'm trying to say I'm being respectful. It seems like it's a low-hanging fruit thing, whereas the easier convictions, the ones that are more obvious, are there. Does it ever come into the question of, even if you may not get a conviction, it's worth going through?
Under the substantial, thank you for raising that. Thank you through the chair to you, Councillor Bonner. There is within our policy, within our CHA1 policy, an ability to go to a somewhat, what's considered a lower standard of charge assessment, which is the reasonable prospect of conviction. So substantial likelihood is actually the highest charge assessment standard in the country. We're the only one that exercise that assessment standard. The rest of the prosecution services use reasonable prospect of conviction, including the Federal Crown, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. We can resort to that, under our policy, resort to that standard when there is a sufficiently high public interest in a prosecution that it warrants going to the lower standard. Now, of course, they can be challenging standards to apply in practice, and it can be difficult. You know, when is it substantial? When is it reasonable? Based on the evidence that's available. But effectively, if there's a strong enough public interest that we think we need to, we can reduce the standard under our policy to assess whether there's a reasonable prospect and proceed accordingly.
And may I just follow up then? Carrying on with that concept, is some of these cases you'll decide not to prosecute. And say it's a violent crime, domestic crime, that sort of thing. Is there any part of your jurisdiction that you are responsible for the victim who in this case is not necessarily in the legal eyes of the law no longer a victim, even though they've been through this, because there's no charges been laid, to help out that person in that particular case? Like, what happens to the people who are victims of crime when the criminal doesn't get prosecuted?
Well, thank you for the question, through Madam Chair. The unfortunate reality is that even if we do proceed with charges, the process is very focused on the actions of the offender. And it's not until, and during the process of determining whether an offense was committed in the course of a trial or say a person pleading guilty, it's not that witness or victim is really just a witness in the eyes of the court, and they hold evidence that the court needs to make an assessment of guilt or innocence. Once the sentencing hearing comes is when there's a somewhat greater role for victims and witnesses. But it's still really about the actions of the offender and what is the appropriate response to those actions from the criminal justice system. So the role and how victims and witnesses are treated by Crown throughout is really about providing information about the process, what's happening, the status of it, and the availability of resources. And there aren't very many resources that are triggered by an actual laying of charges. Some are triggered by, you know, the person having been involved in the incident at all. So from our perspective, it's about providing information, and there'd be obviously less information for us to provide for a less period of time if we don't lay charges. But if charges are laid, it's still only about providing information about where resources are available and trying to treat the person with as much dignity and respect going through the process as we can, because the focus of the entire criminal process is on the offender and the offender's actions. So I'm not sure how better to answer your question, but it's a very individualized process that focuses on the offender as opposed to trying to make the victim or the witness whole. And it's not until the sentencing process when that becomes a little bit more focused on what happened to the victim. I'm not sure if that makes it any more clear.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
No, thank you. And just further to Councillor Bonners, that's where your victim services come into play in Haven House, where they will continue to work with the victim whether or not charge is laid. My question is, we used to have disclosure court back in, what, the 90s, late 90s? Is that still around, or is there any move to bring it back? Because I think that was a very effective means of dealing with some of the, as Councillor Bonner says, low-lying fruits.
If I could ask for just clarification. I'm not familiar with disclosure court, so I may need a little bit of context, Madam Chair.
That's fine. I can follow up later if it's not an issue. Thank you.
Okay, Mayor Crowe.
Thank you very much, Chair, and through you to Councillor Bonner to some extent. The concept behind our system is that the enormous power of the state with the police and prosecution services and judicial system is that the accused stands in a much weaker position, and therefore we hold the state to a very high standard in order to prosecute. Once a person has been accused of a crime in this country, it obviously tarnishes their reputation for a very long time, regardless of whether they're in fact guilty or not guilty of the crime. The fact that they're not charged, however, pardon me, that a charge results in an acquittal doesn't mean you still can't, for instance, pursue a civil remedy if possible. And I think one of the questions that I'm going to ask the prosecutor here today is, and it emphasizes that our system, I think, is a very good system, is of the criminal charges that are laid, how many people actually plead guilty and how many actually end up in a trial?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair, from His Worship. I can't put a percentage on it, but I can say that if people did not plead guilty, the system would grind to a halt. There's simply not enough court time, not enough man hours to function if there was not a fully functioning resolution process in place. And that includes both the negotiations that occur, the strength of the evidence brought forward by the police that support those negotiations, and defense counsel being able to be involved in those discussions. So I can't put numbers on it, but I would say vast majority would be an accurate reflection of the number that resolve prior to trial.
Thank you.
To pick up on that point, my notes to myself say, when assessing the public interest, is that the vast majority of our policies seem to, the message is that we are really to be proceeding on cases that require the full force of the criminal justice system to be invoked against a person. Our public interest assessment requires us to consider a number of factors weighing both for and against prosecution. It's not a science, but there are a number of factors that we need to consider, and they include things like seriousness of the offense, likely sentence, vulnerability of the victims, overrepresentation of Indigenous women and girls as victims, but also overrepresentation of Indigenous offenders in the justice system, the offender's history and criminal record, frequency of the offense in the area, alternatives to prosecution, and the length of an expense of a prosecution considered in relation to the social benefit to be gained by it, and the need to maintain public confidence in the administration of justice. I haven't listed all of them. This is just a few of the massive amounts of factors that we have to consider in assessing whether to pull that trigger on laying charges against someone. And what His Worship Mayor Krogh has mentioned are some of the reasons, is that not everyone ought to be labeled a criminal, and we have to consider the impact both on that person and compare that with what is to be gained by that prosecution, and often that requires considering the seriousness of the offense that's under consideration. So, back to our graphic, we have gone from charge assessment and discussing that process to some extent to the prosecution and what that looks like. Now, conduct of the prosecution can be challenging as Crown. We aren't the lawyers for the victim or the witnesses, and that can be a very challenging role to play because they often mistake us as being lawyers acting on their behalf. Rather, we're conducting prosecutions on behalf of the society as a whole, and our entire job is to ensure that the reputation of the justice system is protected and that we're serving the administration of justice in the course of doing so. We do that by following many of our policies. We have many policies that govern what information and when to share with victims of crime. VIC-1, it refers to VOCA, the Victim of Crimes Act, as well as Canadian Victim Bill of Rights, and those govern what information we have a duty to provide to the public in the course of the process. Generally, it refers to updates, information about the court process and the services that are available, as well as the right to create a victim impact statement and the right to request restitution. We also have specific policies that govern our relationship with vulnerable victims and witnesses, both adult as well as children. VUL 1 and CHI 1. Excuse me. And you have already heard from me on my point of what an individualized process focused on the offender, the criminal justice system is. And it's not a substitute for repairing relationships, unfortunately. Another aspect of conducting prosecutions, which is one that's probably fairly forefront in terms of the public's discussion about public safety and how things could be improved, is bail. And bail is, i.e. the person's status in custody on conditions or not, while they are charged with a criminal offense. So everyone who is charged with a criminal offense is entitled to be released on the least onerous terms possible. And I say possible, that is possible, i.e. reasonable and necessary to protect the public. There is a large push in the case law towards reasonable and necessary being very strictly construed. In the past, I've been involved in projects where, not involved, I've helped prosecute after projects were put in place to try to put a lot of offenders on a no-go for a particular area. Red zoning is the common term for that. The case law is not supportive of that as an approach anymore. Neither excommunication, i.e. Putting the offender on conditions, or the accused person, as they would be while on bail, putting them on conditions not to be within a community. There's no support for that in the case law anymore. Similarly, abstinence conditions are not getting much traction with the court anymore due to addiction issues. You're simply setting the person up for failure. So when it comes to bail, we have, again, policies that govern our exercise of our discretion in whether to seek to have the person detained in custody. But at the end of the day, the message is restraint. And we do not take lightly the prospect of seeking someone's detention in custody until they are brought to trial or plead guilty. And this is because of the fact that they are innocent until proven guilty. And even if they have a horrendous criminal record, we have to bear in mind the fact that we may be putting an innocent person in custody until they are found guilty. I'm going to skip through this very quickly. The reasons we would seek a person's custody is to ensure that they attend court, to ensure that they don't commit any more offenses, or to maintain public confidence in the administration of justice. Those are the grounds that we can use to try to justify either putting onerous conditions on a person or keeping them in custody. The other aspect of conducting a prosecution is, of course, the trial. And a trial is where a person's guilt or innocence is determined. The Crown's job in the course of that trial is to muster evidence to try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person's guilty. I'm going to skip through this because I suspect this is very much a review for all of you, but it's in your PowerPoint should you have any questions about that, and I'm happy to answer. So skipping to what, and I'm recognizing the time, and I apologize that I'm probably taking up more than my allocated time, but I do want to spend a few minutes on sentencing because I suspect that that's quite important to your discussions. So when a person is found guilty or pleads guilty, they are sentenced. Crown Counsel and Defense Counsel appear in court generally and make recommendations or submissions as to the sentence that is appropriate for the offense that the person's been convicted of. Our sentencing submissions are then considered by the judge, who makes their determination of what the appropriate sentence is, and even if it is a joint submission by counsel, the judge can overrule it and either go higher or lower. So the criminal code, which is the piece of legislation we're most concerned with most of the time when it comes to true offenses and property crime, B&E, assault, all violent offenses are within the criminal code. It prescribes the purpose of sentencing, the objectives of sentencing, the principles of sentencing, and the sentencing options that are available for different crimes. Here below is in darker lighting is the fundamental purpose of sentencing: to protect society and contribute, along with crime prevention initiatives, to respect for the law and maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society. And it does so by imposing sanctions that seek to achieve the objectives of sentencing: denunciation, deterrence, separation of the person from society where necessary, rehabilitation, and a sense of responsibility and reparation for harm done. This is a large and important list of goals, and spoiler alert, as we'll see, the criminal code contains very few tools to reach them. In fact, there are many more goals than there are tools. For youth, and I'll just note, who are considered 12 to 18 years old, the purposes are a bit different, and the focus is on rehabilitation. The deterrence of like-minded individuals is not an appropriate objective of a youth sentencing. So here are the principles of sentencing, and I'm not going to read them to you, but they break down to 3 important points: proportionality, totality, and restraint. So what are the options for sentencing? And as I mentioned, as I flagged for you, there are precious few options. So under the criminal code, we have discharges, fines, community supervision, and imprisonment. Discharges are essentially, they're generally used for lower level offenses, and a person can be discharged of an offense either conditionally or absolutely. If they're absolutely discharged, they have no criminal record, and that's the end of it. If they are discharged conditionally, once their terms of the discharge are satisfied, i.e. they do not breach the conditions they're on for whatever length of time they're placed on them, they then do not have a criminal record. The remaining options are fines, community supervision, and imprisonment. And community supervision, of course, can be probation, and it can follow a term of imprisonment, or it can be included with a fine. Or the alternative community supervision is a conditional sentence order, and that is essentially considered jail in the community. The general purpose of a probation order is rehabilitative. A community supervision order in the form of a conditional sentence order is jail in the community, is supposed to be more punitive in nature and aimed at specific and general deterrence. So as you can see, these are our 4 options to try to address all of those objectives of sentencing that we just discussed. We, of course, again, have many policies that hamper and describe and support our decision-making in deciding what sentencing position to take in a particular matter. I've listed some here. If you're curious, please feel free to go look at them. These policies incorporate many changes that have happened recently in furtherance of our BC Prosecution Service Indigenous Justice Strategy that is aimed at reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous offenders in custody, and they have been adopted into each policy as appropriate. So at the end of the day, the criminal process, I would suggest, is a very blunt instrument that offers us limited options in terms of outcomes. It focuses on holding offenders responsible and is premised upon deterrence, the deterrence function, both in terms of deterring that particular person as well as like-minded persons. But unfortunately, it's inherently responsive as opposed to proactive. So it does not make for a good proactive response to public safety concerns.
Question, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Could you maybe just touch on that the judges really don't use what's happening in other provinces when they're looking at their case law? For the most part, is it not correct that they're looking at what's happening with the BC courts? Because again, it's something that the public says, well, in Alberta, they got 5 years, yet in BC, they get 2 years. Or, you know, so I think that's important, if you could touch on that.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair, through you to Councillor Armstrong. Generally speaking, when it comes to sentencing, yes, I think that would be an accurate statement of the law, that judges use decisions from local decisions as most persuasive. They look to BC first. In fact, so in British Columbia, we have 3 levels of court: the provincial court, the Supreme Court, and then the Court of Appeal. We're ignoring appeals for today, so the other 2 is what we're discussing. Provincial court judges would look to other provincial court level decisions as persuasive. They would actually be bound to the extent that they're on all fours with the decision they are to make. They would be bound by a decision from the Supreme Court of British Columbia. They would also be bound by appellate level court decisions. Decisions from other provinces could also be considered persuasive, but when it comes to sentencing, because it's such an individualized process that does focus somewhat on the community, it really is BC decisions that carry the day in terms of persuasive effect. And it's very true that the Alberta courts do seem to get higher sentences.
Thank you very much.
I've got 2 more speakers, Councillor Hemmens and Councillor Brown. Councillor Hemmens.
Thank you, Chair. So this is actually all new to me. And I'm going to ask you a question that I think a lot of people in our community would ask, and that's that we hear a lot about the bottleneck in the justice system. So we hear about someone maybe who's arrested breaking and entering into a car, and then the next day they're back out on the streets. And so my question is, we're hearing from police that they've kind of changed how they do operations in response. The city, arguably, we are changing how we do our governance as a response, and I think we're also hearing from our agencies that are frontline service providers, they're changing how they do things. So has there been an equal response in the criminal justice system, or is the system just too large? Like, maybe you could just comment on that. Thank you. My very question.
Thank you for that question, through Madam Chair, to Councillor Hemmens. That's a difficult question to answer. I think that the criminal justice system is quite slow in terms of its response to trends. to the extent that there is a bottleneck in the system. One of the cases I wanted to refer to is the Jordan decision that most of you have probably heard of, which put presumptive time limits on the amount of time that trials can take to conclude in provincial court and Supreme Court. That applied a fairly significant amount of pressure on all parties in the criminal justice system, specifically the Crown as well as the police. Once a charge is laid, and that's when the clock starts ticking, then we have 18 months to try to get it through the system with finite resources. Finite resources in terms of Crown, finite resources in terms of money, finite resources in terms of how many hours of court time are available, and that can be a much higher constraint depending on the community that you're in. Here in Nanaimo, we're quite lucky, and it's much easier to get on in terms of court time than it is in other communities, so I can say that. But in terms of responsiveness to that, I'm not sure if I understand what you mean in terms of responsive to an issue. If there's a public safety issue in a particular area, that's a factor that would be considered in terms of the sentencing at the end of the day, but in terms of, and it's also for us in terms of whether we approve charges. That's one of our enumerated factors in our policy about whether the matter should enter the criminal justice system. But how it gets dealt with in the criminal justice system, unfortunately, isn't impacted by the needs necessarily of the community, because there's not room for the criminal justice system to be that responsive to the individual community, because it's premised on such big picture policy standpoints that it can't respond to the needs of every community in the same way, because it's across the country. So things like us having to prove the matter beyond a reasonable doubt and innocence until being proven guilty are all policies that we're not even policies, they're fundamental principles of justice that we're stuck with. So it does hamper the ability of the criminal justice system to be responsive, which is what part of what I was trying to imply with my closing remarks, that it's a slow, somewhat cumbersome process that we're stuck with, and it's not able to be responsive in a quick way to what needs the community may be seeing. Another quote from the McQuaig report that is somewhat helpful and might explain this better than I was able to. But our criminal justice system, which has evolved and been refined over centuries, can be slow to respond to societal changes and public expectations. This is as it should be, as it is designed to provide a fair, rational hearing to an accused on the evidence presented, as free as possible from extraneous emotion. I can't say it better than that, but the responsiveness can happen when it comes to the files that are provided to us by the RCMP, what files have a heightened public interest in the community in our charge assessment process, and then in terms of the sentencing process, what's going on in the particular community can play a factor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chairman, through you. Just curious, in the case of where joint submissions are made, I understand that probably introduces a mechanism for efficiency. What conditions or limits would the judge have to overrule that or change what was submitted through the joint submission of counsel?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. To Councillor Brown. The judge is the ultimate decider at the end of the day. They get to decide what they view as a fit sentence. It has to be a legal sentence, but what they view as a fit sentence within the parameters of the law for that particular offender, for that particular offense. As counsel, Crown, and defense, we negotiate a lot and generally speaking, there's a lot of negotiation that would go into a joint submission. The court is aware of that. There was a recent Supreme Court of Canada case that reminded judges of that they don't always know everything that's about the case, that counsel often negotiate to try to come to a just and fair resolution, a proper resolution, and that they're to take that into consideration. So there is quite a significant threshold for they have to be satisfied that it's an unfit sentence before they can reject it, I think is what that case stands for. And that was a relatively recent reminder, I think, to trial judges that there's a lot of behind the scenes that happens when counsel, as officers of the court, are coming before them with a joint submission.
Thank you. And Councillor Armstrong.
My last one. I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to come forward. You guys have a really hard job. You're working, you work very hard for our community, and you always hear the negative, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Your Worship and Council.
Thank you. And we have Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just adjusting a little bit for our schedule and our time, and before I get on to that, I just want to again thank Ms. Patterson for attending today. She's the one speaker from that's not on staff, and we're really happy to have her join and be part of the presentation. Her actual PowerPoint, because it's not part of staff's presentation, you have not actually received yet. It won't be in front of you, but it will be part of the minutes, and you'll get that distributed to you later. I'm going to suggest right now, we're running a few minutes behind, so maybe we'll take our break right now, just a quick break if that's okay, because during the break time, if you remember, we're going to have training for you, and we're just going to take a few minutes for staff to get set up, so maybe if I could ask just a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back in here for part of your training break.
We'll have a 5-minute break. Thank you.
We are, okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to Mr. LaBerge, who's going to continue with our presentation.
Thank you.
Fire department's always a tough act to follow. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Your Worship and Council. I'd like to follow up on some of the pieces that Superintendent Miller and Ms. Patterson were talking about as far as the context out on the street and then some of the criminal justice responses. Particularly what I'd like to start with is the issue of open and closed drug markets. So I'll step out of the paradigm of bylaws a little bit and talk about policing and where resources go and how it goes down to the context of street level dealing. So the slide I've presented here shows that there are many layers in the hierarchy of drug trafficking as it occurs in our society. At the very top, we have organized crime that resonates right down to the street level dealer. When you look at the priorities of enforcement, the goal is always to try to interdict as high up in the hierarchy as possible, and that's why you always see that policing resources try to start at the very top. The goal is really to reduce the gang violence associated with drug trafficking and to prevent the emergence of powerful organized crime groups. I don't know how successful we are at that in British Columbia, because currently we have about 188 organized crime groups that operate in British Columbia. And I know from my experience when I was a police officer that we have the capacity to target about the top 20%. I don't suspect that's changed at all, Superintendent Miller. So yeah, so police and resources can target about the top 20% of organized crime. On the local level, we put a lot of resources into trying to control street level crimes that are committed by drug users, and the same try to improve the health and social well-being of the users themselves. And one of the most important things that we want to talk about today then is how do we restore the quality of life for neighborhoods that are impacted by street level drug activities. I can't overemphasize, and you heard from Ms. Patterson how complex and blunt and reactive the criminal justice system is. It's very easy for us to exhaust the scarce resources of the front lines, that in police, courts, corrections, and in the city, dealing with low-level matters. The lowest end of drug trafficking, we have two types of markets. We have closed markets, which are person-specific. And this is kind of where you have your dealer and their known buyers. This type of market typically has a much lower level of risk to the participants because they know each other. There's usually ongoing relationships, which also brings with it the opportunity to resolve disagreements, and they want to sustain relationships for future engagement. These will occur either at known locations like drug houses, and we do have some municipal tools that we deal with those, or in undefined areas. This might be your dial-a-doper or the people that traffic at nightclubs and those types of things. The other type of drug dealing we have in the lowest level is place-specific. We call these on the street open-air drug markets. These are typically geographically well-defined spaces. And here we have a much higher risk to the participants that are involved, specifically because the interactions are typically anonymous. They tend to be spontaneous and unplanned. They're opportunistic. And there's no avenues for recompense on either side. And therefore, they're prone to kind of the street-level rip-offs, both by the dealers and by the people on the street. And this leads to patterns of systemic violence, which is evidenced all the time on our streets. Just in this past week, we had a stabbing on Wesley Street behind Sark, and that's the type of systemic violence that we in these open-air drug markets. Sorry about that. So here we have some photographs of Wesley Street in proximity to the overdose prevention site, and this is an example of an open-air drug market. I was a street-level police officer when the OPS opened, and I can tell you that this market proliferated with the opening of the OPS because with it came perceptions of permissiveness. It was touted as a safe place to use illicit drugs where there would be support in response to overdose. And more than anything, there was an expectation that police would not undermine the goals of an OPS or marginalize the users by doing enforcement in these areas. Now that this OPS is established and entrenched, we find that enforcement has very little impact on the size of the market that occurs there or the quantity of drugs that are consumed on the street. I can tell you in recent months what we found is that when we try to do more enforcement, it leads to two things. One, adaptation, meaning the way that the markets react, and it also causes unintended consequences. And a few examples I can give you is if there's a presence of police on the street on Wesley Street, what we'll find is that the drug trafficking activities will often be pushed into the adjacent business districts, meaning the dental clinic or the pediatrician clinic, that the deals now take place on their property, in their parking lots, etc. And this is the type of displacement that's often an unintended consequence of enforcement. We also find that the dealers will force vulnerable addicts to do the street-level dealing, and over time, as we found with the red zone that we had in the city a dozen years ago, it can sometimes cause a transition from an open market to closed drug markets in the adaptation of having drug houses in neighborhoods. As you all know, open-air drug markets contribute to a wide range of social disorder and drug-related crime. This manifests in the likes of disorderly conduct, begging or soliciting, widespread loitering, graffiti, litter, damage to property, prostitution, theft from vehicles, break-in, shoplifting, weapon offenses, and assaults. As these types of activities become more blatant, what we find is that the residents retreat from the market area, rendering that whole area unusable to the local community. When that kind of thing happens, what we find is what we call a tipping point or neighborhood threshold, which I'll explain a bit more in a moment. What I want to tell you is cities can influence the public or built environment, and what you see here is what we call CPTED principles, or crime prevention through environmental design. And that's a proposition that features the natural and built environment can create a concept of defensible space, as was termed by Oscar Newman. The ideas behind defensible space include things such as natural surveillance, meaning having people that can look into what's happening, controlling the access to an area, or creating a sense of territoriality. And you'll see a lot of these types of elements that have really been brought forward in behind the SARC building. Also as important is the broken window principle, which suggests that neglected zones can invite crime. This reinforces the property crime maintenance, reinforcing the property maintenance to assert visible ownership of space is very, very important. But for CPTED design features to be effective, we find that broader community influences are necessary. That means a neighborhood needs capable guardians, and that's a community of people who are connected and capable and also motivated to defend public space against what we see in that third area, the surrounding environment. What are the types of things that generate crime or facilitate it or precipitate it? When these types of features dominate the environment, what we find is crime and disorder prevail. This is when the neighborhood capacity is exceeded and that we find our neighborhoods retreat from these spaces. In actual fact, we often refer to this in CPTED as offensive space, meaning that the culture of disorder or violence is what will be the norms of these types of areas. About 3 weeks ago, we had an earthquake drill at the SARC building, and they evacuated half the building out the front and the remainder out the back door. And I think what was really telling for me that the street behind SARC had tipped was when we had that earthquake drill, and we had probably 75 to 100 people that exited down the street, and there were a circle of people that were interjecting intravenously and passing meth pipes around, and our entire staff walked probably within 10 feet of the user group, and it didn't disrupt or alarm or change that type of behavior. To me, that's the type of indication that an area or neighborhood has tipped, and there's really no concerns of any type of enforcement retribution. So that kind of leads us into why we've taken a very assertive current practices in removing and enforcing the encampments. This council came in December just as we were closing the tent city on Port Drive, which at the time was the largest tent city in British Columbia. That action left of us 2 temporary housing sites in different areas of the city and an open-air drug market downtown, in addition to probably an estimated 70-plus encampments around the city. Many of the homeless advocates question why we require shelter to be removed daily and why we remove property regularly from the communal camps where vulnerable individuals feel that they might be safer with other folks. And a lot of that rationale came from the Supreme Court judge that heard the tent city matter last year. And it was the finding of the court that this congregate living, whether it's in a tent city or where people congregate together, don't really work. They didn't work in Nanaimo and they don't work in other communities. And four of the important pieces the judge found is that when you have these things, they always try to create a system of governance or control, that these tend to fail very, very quickly. In the case of our tent city, it was probably within about 2 weeks that we saw the controls and the conduct and behavior that they started to fail. As the governance starts to fail from within, significant risks increase as the camp grows, and this is in the form of fires and explosions, violence, weapons, theft and crime within the user populations in the group. As time progresses, and we found with our tent city, criminal factions take over control, bringing with it increasing violence. And then flowing from that is the resulting harms to the neighborhood in the forms of fear, crime, and the disorder pieces. So this is why we've been strongly reactive, because now that we have an open drug market and not a tent city, a lot of the same elements exist. And we find that we have to be very responsive as a municipality. If we leave these areas unattended, they grow in size and impact, and they cause harms to the adjacent neighborhoods. An example that I brought up at a recent GPC was the encampments that we took down in the Millstone area recently, where we removed, I think, 7 one-ton truckloads of debris from an encampment that had only about 12 or 14 folks on it. These types of efforts are also done on Wesley Street, up to 3 and even 5 times a week now. We find that we have pallet fires on the street, damage to our infrastructure, graffiti, garbage, and significant accumulations of property. So the thing I really want to emphasize is that, you've heard from the police. The police have broad authorities to deal with people in unlawful behaviors. But we as a city have a lot of authorities that regulate the use of land and property. And in your time in council, we've brought a number of bylaws to try to be responsive to some of these challenges. We've talked at length about the Parks bylaw, which now aligns with the decisions of the Supreme Court of BC. And that controls and limits the sheltering that's permitted in undeveloped areas of our parks between 7 p.m. and 9 a.m., and with the requirement that the belongings must be removed every morning. You also enacted a new public nuisance bylaw this spring. We haven't talked a lot about that, but this is the bylaw that we use in areas like Wesley Street that prohibits the scattering and accumulation of chattels in public spaces, particularly in a manner that impede vehicles or other persons. We also have a property maintenance bylaw, and that can address encampments that occur on private property, such as what we recently found on Caledonia Avenue. This bylaw puts a requirement on the property owner that they remove any transitory or permanent sheltering on their property, which most often is done with the assistance of the police and bylaw services. Another bylaw that you also recently enacted was a new nuisance abatement bylaw. As I said, over time, you'll find that these open and closed drug markets transition from one form to another, and our nuisance abatement bylaw is a very effective tool that we have as a municipality to recover the costs abating nuisances that emerge from private property, such as drug houses. So I just want to wrap up because I know that we're a little bit behind in time, just talking about the downtown and security patrols and what it looks like pre and post Tent City. You see from the chart that we actually had significant municipal investments into proactive patrols downtown 2017 and prior. And that was in the form from the policing of a full-time bike patrol with the RCMP. That was 8 officers. And they also had a RCMP foot patrol officer, a retired reserve constable that came back that patrolled the streets downtown exclusively 3 to 5 times a week. And in addition, the city previously funded private security patrols, and this was 2 officers full-time during the daytime hours. With retirements and changes in focus with the RCMP, we lost the reserve patrols around the time that Tent City started in 2018. And so the bike patrol, of course, was still the lead with the city, or with the RCMP rather, and we shifted our private security patrols first to have one security patroller for 24 hours a day, and then as Tent City got larger and larger, we had 2 officers that were patrolling 24 hours a day. This funding ran out at the end of December, around the time the Tent City closed, so we went from 2 full-time private security guards down to 1 security guard 18 hours a day. What I can tell you, I'm not a big advocate of using private security in lieu of police officers or bylaw officers. It's not a panacea, but what it does is it enables us to target, harden, and protect specific sites and infrastructure that are vulnerable to crime. And I can tell you with the 18 hours of private security contract service I have available, that I put them for all 18 hours in our 3 city parkades now, just because they're targeted so heavily by vehicle crime, and that's just one of the tough realities moving forward. So I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to stop it there and leave it open to any questions you may have.
Councillor Mayor Krog.
Actually, I wasn't, but.
I'm on.
Asked me.
Councillor Armstrong, sorry.
Thank you. Earlier today, we looked at your business case that was deferred, looking at increasing your bylaw hours from 35 to 40. Would that have a significant impact on any security downtown if we were able to do that? What's your thoughts on that? Or how would you utilize those hours?
Well, through the chair to Councillor Armstrong, yes, I mean, I've talked to a number of occasions recently about how taxed our resources are, and this would just be another 5 hours per officer per week spread over, and it would be close to the equivalent of having another bylaw officer. So certainly we could spread out the hours of coverage and be more responsive to the community and to the other city departments. I think one thing that was brought to my attention by the HR department as well is that the trend historically was that outdoor workers worked a 40-hour work week and indoor workers were more 35, and it was recognized some time ago that the work that these officers do really is outdoor work and would be more in alignment with those lines, although when I look at the HR structure, it's not necessarily an indoor outdoor worker type model.
Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Mr. LaBerge. The work that we're doing in the parking lots, prior to getting elected and even after that, I would hear a lot from the hotels in the area who actually pay to have their clients park there, and we're getting broken in daily. Has that been mitigated at all? Are we still having issues along those fronts? How effective is this patrols that you're putting there been?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, that's an excellent question. As I say, I've put all of my private security resources in there during the nighttime hours, but the reality is that the theft and property crime continues to persist downtown. A lot of it's still occurring in our parkades. There are other measures that you can do to protect infrastructure like parkades, but it's not foolproof and very expensive, like security gates and CCTV cameras and 24-hour parking attendants. But these all come at significant costs, and at the end of the day, really the challenge is that we have a substantial homeless and poverty problem downtown, and there's folks that are around these areas, and whether the thefts occur out of our parkades or the adjacent streets, I think it's just evidence of a deeper systemic problem that we have to address.
So if I may, one more then, being how we're in budget and all that other sort of stuff, and you don't have to answer this if you don't feel comfortable about it, but like, what would be your wish list to make the downtown more safe for people traveling here, even if it's in their minds, to make this a much more safe and inviting place?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, I think one of the most important features is properly equipping and resourcing your police department, who really have the tools to deal with these things. Really important threads are the housing strategies and just finding secure places for folks to live that are on our streets now. And I think we really have to look at some solutions to our issues of this open air drug market that we have on Wesley Street. The one thing when you have an area that's socially collapsed the way that has is that type of harm doesn't stay.
Amenable hours a week, or would it? What's the pros and cons of that as opposed to just having another additional officer in terms of coverage? Just curious.
Chair to Councillor Gesselbrock, it's a very good question, and certainly there's a certain element of stress for the type of work that's done, but it was actually the notion of working a 4-hour week was brought to me by my staff. They currently do a lot of rescheduling for a lot of the events, whether it be the Marine Festival weekend or the night markets. These always are important, impactful events for downtown, and they occur during the hours that they're not working, and they usually reschedule without compensation. And they just feel that if they have more hours during the week, that they can schedule and be more versatile, that they can support a lot of this type of programming more effectively.
Thank you. Can I have one more follow-up
Yes.
question here? Thank you. Sort of the open-air drug markets, is Wesley Street really the only place that we're seeing this occur at the moment, or is there other locations where this is becoming a thing?
Through the chair, I would say that the most intensive open-air market we have is on the Wesley Street area. You know, we see pockets of street-level dealing up and down Nickel Street, for instance, off Victoria Road, but nothing to the extent of what we see on Wesley Street. Most of what we see in other areas are usually temporary displacements when there are enforcement measures that are occurring on Wesley Street.
And does there tend to be an increase in property crime around these areas, or is it mostly just the drug use and sort of the, you know, it's more of the public disorder, but in terms of property crime, does that tend to be?
Well, through the chair, I have to go anecdotally from my days as a police officer and what I observe, but if the amount of property materials that are brought into Wesley Street every day, I would say that there are direct impacts, all the ones that I described, from graffiti to violence to thefts and everything else, and in that area, they're all correlated to that market on Wesley Street. Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Croak.
Thank you very much, through the chair, to Mr. LaBerge. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. We're starting to get letters now from people who are saying, look, if you allow the Wesley Street situation to continue, then basically it's the seed of the downtown east side, and God knows that's been a disaster from every angle for several decades now. And I suppose the blunt question is, I'm generally resigned to the fact that if you broke up Wesley Street, it would reform at some other place in the community in fairly short order, but it would at least break it up. And I suppose the very practical question is, what would it take to physically, if you will, within the law, take to break up what's happening on Wesley Street? I mean, I think it's safe to say that if in any of our neighborhoods as council members, if that was occurring, we'd be outraged. And you know, frankly, several hundred city employees go to work every day. This is occurring, you know, I don't want to sound all silly about this, but within, you know, a few hundred yards of the mayor's office and a few hundred yards down the hill from the police station. And I think for the average citizen, they're looking to us, unfortunately, and whoever else they can look to see that this doesn't happen. So if you can give me a practical answer, I'd be delighted, and if you can't, I'll understand too.
Through the chair, to your worship, really good points, and it would be my experience is when an area is tipped and the type of disorder that we've seen and that I've described prevails, they just create so much more opportunity for the types of disorders and the types of crimes that flow from it. And when you break these types of markets up, yes, there's displacements and impacts in other places, but there's also diffusion. And I find that if you don't have these significantly collapsed areas that are under extreme duress, yes, absolutely, you're spreading it around, but the resulting disorders usually aren't comparable to the types of consequences we see in having the situation that we have now. Certainly, I think we have some opportunities moving forward as more housing opportunities come into play, et cetera. I think part of the challenge on Wesley Street is that there was a period of time, and I don't know if it still exists, where a permissiveness or an expectation that this was the safe place where people could go and not be disrupted by the police. I think maybe the folks that took that position are starting to back off, because the comment on the street is, these are our clients, or this is an enforcement problem. I don't think that what we see on Wesley Street, that the genesis of that was enforcement. It was the failure to recognize and manage, putting an OPS there, and the expectation that people could go and do certain activities without being accountable to the broader community or to enforcement.
Anything further?
I'm asking a very practical question. How does one break up a situation like that? Do you send in a police squad? Do you, start charging people? I mean, what do you do in a practical way? I mean, clearly, if someone was buying drugs outside my house, I'd phone the police, and the expectation is a police officer would arrive, and if they were discovered with drugs in their person, whatever those would be, assuming they're illicit substances, there'd be a charge, there'd be something, and the impression is everybody just keeps coming back there every day, day in, day out. And so it's a very practical question. What is it, if we have any jurisdiction to do it, or what is it the police can do? And I know they're hamstrung by all kinds of things, but I mean, what is it to break it up, to send, if nothing else, to this, a signal to the community that you know, we're not going to continue to accept this as a daily occurrence in Nanaimo. God forgive me the use of that phrase.
I'm wondering if Superintendent Miller, or you have the answer, Mr.
Well, through the chair to his worship, we've done this before, and then unfortunately what's different from a dozen years ago is the tools that we had previously, like red zones, aren't really supported by the courts anymore. But what we do have is we have a space with stakeholders around it, and one of the folks in the gallery today is Gord Cote, the executive director of NARSA, that runs Harris House. Harris House is run very, very successfully. It's a health clinic on the corner of Wesley and Franklin. They were successful because they had regular meetings within the neighborhood. They checked in on what types of impacts were there, and then they figured out what measures were necessary to mitigate them. It's the types of things that were done with the Wesley Street building run by Canadian Mental Health years ago that's kind of gone by the wayside. We need to bring all those stakeholders, the folks that run the OPS, the city that own this, the school district, and collectively determine all the tools or options we have to respectively manage each of our properties. And yes, certainly there will be an enforcement piece that'll have to go with that, and an education of the folks that the behaviors and the status quo that have gone unchecked for so long are now going to change, and that some of that change is going to have to come from within those groups as well.
I see I've got Councillor Hemmons, Councillor Armstrong, but Mr. Rudolph, should I have him speak first? Thank you.
Just one way in. Madam Chair, you're asking for, I think you should hear from the superintendent what the police are actually doing on that street, what bylaws are actually doing, but there's been a ramping up, and maybe it's in waves of enforcement, but there's been an ask to be vigilant and cannot tolerate the presence of this because it symbolizes something that doesn't make anybody comfortable. So there's the vigilance of enforcement is ongoing, and I'm sure they can specifically comment on you, but it's basically an everyday thing. As soon as you clean it up, it's it's back. So it's a non-ending thing. The second thing is the adjacent building, which is the school, the district property, is in the cusp of being renovated. So the hope is that with that building getting restored, that there's an improvement to the aesthetic and maybe some positive activity in the neighborhood. That there might be a corollary comment to that, depending on the use of the building. So that presence of that vacant building doesn't help. And so it may help to have it fixed. The third piece is the installation of the fences have contained it, and maybe there's pros and cons to that as well. Certainly there's been protection afforded to some of the properties through there, and that's been beneficial in some ways, but it also hems folks in, which from a policing point of view may be beneficial. But the ability to poke the road through or across and make it a through road probably would be helpful, but that's not property that the city owns. And it's no recipe for fixing it either, because Surrey, their famous 135A Street, was a through street. And it was just a side street just like this, and it was just as bad, if not worse, for years. So I don't think that that's necessarily a recipe, but I think probably the best person to answer some of your questions about what can be done through his worship is through what is being done, and is that enough?
And I've got Superintendent Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a couple of things. I'd just like to build on what Mr. LeBeur said and what Mr. Rudolph said. One of my priorities now to the detachment and the bike patrol unit has been enforcement on Wesley Street. So we'll go down there at 9 o'clock in the morning, as Mr. LeBeur said, consistent with the court decision. And we'll go down there with bylaws, with his team, and we'll clean the place up. and it's cleaned by about 10 o'clock. We'll come back at noon and the camps are reset. So it's a game, as I mentioned earlier, of whack-a-mole. And, you know, game is not the right word, actually. I apologize for saying that, but it's a situation where we find ourselves in this. So one of the things we found out with Portugal is they turned this into a health crisis, not a police matter. And what the Portuguese did is that people with simple possession and casual drug users were put through the health system, not the police system. Because once you become addicted to drugs, this becomes a health issue, not a police matter. And they found out that the number of intravenous drug users over the 10 years that they've implemented has dropped from 100,000 down to 30,000. So they've seen big decreases in the amount of drug use going on. Still traffickers and people pushing large amount of drugs are processed through the criminal process, but by taking the smaller people out of the process, that gave the courts more time to deal with the people trafficking. Now, Mr. LaBerge also mentioned that, you know, Canadian Mental Health and Harris House had done a lot of good work. Well, that's similar to the Portugal thing, and people were getting treatment. So do we need VHA to come part of the situation? From the enforcement point of view, we cannot arrest our way out of this one because they will just move, as His Worship said, they will move from one place to another. And one of the issues, if we move them off Wesley Street, where will they go? Will they go down to a culturally sensitive place like Maffeo Sutton Park? I've heard nobody mention the homeless people taking up camp and residence along the seawall. So, I mean, that's one area we sweep regularly, and, you know, whether it's an unwritten rule or whether they just know better, they do feel safe in that environment, as Mr. LaBerge said, so that's where they congregate on Wesley Street, similar to what they did at One Port Place. We will continue to go down at 9 o'clock in the morning, back at noon, and continue to do the proactive enforcement, but that's not solving our problem if these people are addiction and need the medical help. So that's sort of my thoughts on that. I don't know if that answers His Worship's question, Madam Chair, or not.
I think that helps. So, thank you. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. I think I have about 8 more questions since conversation started, but I'll start with the one that had me press the button, and that's, you talk a lot about this concept of the tipping point and that we've now passed it. I understand that in the past Nanaimo has done this before, and the red zone was implemented, which is no longer supported by law. So I'm curious, what tools do we have at our disposal, whether it be learning from places like Surrey and 135A, or learning from best practices in the downtown east side? Like, it's all well and good to say we've passed the tipping point, but what are some kind of innovative things that we could be looking at doing? I know that's a huge question, and that you've already responded to Councillor Bonner around housing, but I'm just curious, you have a long history of policing. Is there something that we could be doing to kind of reverse this tipping point? And I know later in your slides you do talk about community pride. I believe it's your presentation, and a sense of community place, and I will share, I live in a neighborhood that has what I believe to be a fairly open-air drug market, and on the weekend, myself, my children, and some neighborhood kids were playing soccer in a field, and there was a lot of peripheral activity around the park, and as soon as we came in and we started playing soccer, and then another mom came in and started picking up litter, that activity dispersed. And so I think there is some community responsibility and personal ownership in saying, this is my community, and I'm going to use this space in the way that makes sense for me. But from a city perspective, what kind of resources or tools could we look at employing to reverse this tipping point?
Through the chair to Councillor Hemmons, I think I'd probably be on the talk show circuit making millions if I had the easy answer to that. All communities are dealing with the types of problems that we're describing, and you made some really important points. And one that we've always said is that busy streets and busy parks tend to be safe ones, and it's, you know, when you look at Wesley Street, as Superintendent Miller said, we applied tools of CEPTED, one of which is access control, or in policing we call it kettling, meaning that we took away all the escape routes, and by all senses of enforcement, we should really heighten the people's sense of risk of apprehension when we create those types of conditions, yet it hasn't really displaced it. What you tend to do, as I say, is you have unintended consequences of pushing some of the related activities like trafficking into your adjacent areas, around your businesses, et cetera. So really, I think we have to look at that whole area, and it's tricky from an environmental perspective, because on the city side, although we are kind of a strong, capable guardian, we're also only there for 7 or 8 hours a day, and then the street, then our buildings go dark, then you have a derelict school district site, and really, we're those capable guardians for most of the day, and I think if you want to turn it around, you have to look at it in those types of senses. How can you start creating an area that the neighborhood can use and embrace and take back, and what are those opportunities? And I think they're a little bit scarce. As I said, when we did the red zone a decade ago, we used a lot of tools, and a lot of it was driven by court orders to kind of break up the nucleus. And as we see, that's not available through the course the way that it once was. I don't know, Superintendent Miller, if you've had any other comments?
Could I just follow up with a couple of points? One is that I actually spent some time in Kelowna this summer, and I connected with one of their city councilors, and we did a walkthrough of their Wesley Street. And they had just a few months previous, I believe, implemented a policy of kind of dispersal. And when I asked how it was going, it was very much what Superintendent Miller is saying, is that the disbursement would happen for a very brief period, and then it would return, and that it was this particular councillor felt that it was a very intensive drain on RCMP resources, because they would bring in 3 squad cars, and it was a really big deal. And one other point regarding the Portuguese model, I'm curious, I know it's the mayor of Port Alberni, I believe, that really advocates for this, and I know there's some issues with legality, the province versus the feds, but this might be a really interesting discussion for the Health and Housing Task Force, to maybe invite the past mayor of Port Alberni to come and speak to us about his ideas around this. Thank you.
Thank you. Superintendent, I have you on the queue. Did you? No? Okay. Councillor Gassenbrock.
Thank you, Chair. Through you. Yeah, I think there's the immediate situation where there's social disorder on Wesley Street and this, and I'd like to make sure that we have policies in place that aren't making the situation worse or allowing it to gain more traction based on the elements that we have control of, and recognizing that this is a larger social issue that's happening at many different levels, provincially and federally, that there's a lot of things as a local municipality we can't control. But when I think about, with issues such as climate change, where local municipalities are communicating and creating a bit of a coalition that is lobbying at the provincial and federal level, I would love to see a stronger advocacy plan, and it might take a while to build what the vision of what we actually need the province and the federal government to be doing, the changes that we need, so that we can very actively be sending that messaging out with letters in our communications through AVICC, UBCM, because I don't feel at this stage of the game, from what I hear at the provincial level, at the federal level, and where we at municipally, that there is a vision, a solution, an endpoint even in sight. I haven't heard that clearly articulated yet, and I think that it's not even at the stage where that's possible, but I think having a plan to have those conversations, to build that, because I don't know if it's going to come from the province. I think because the municipalities are dealing with this at the ground level, and we know what the specific details of the issues are, that the solution is going to be generated in part from the ground up. And I would like to see that that type of organizing, and it is happening through the Health and Housing Task Force, in conjunction with public safety and that. But I think that we need to, just as we're pressing hard for climate change and that, the same thing in this sense, and come up with more of a concrete advocacy plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
Just going back to your point earlier, you talked about when the overdose prevention site opened up, and that's when I believe we saw a huge increase in the problem down there. Would you concur with that?
Through the chair, yes, I would.
And would that be because police were told indirectly that, you know, you don't want to be down in that area because we're going to discourage people from going there, which led to this big open-air market. Would you say that's accurate as well?
It wasn't indirect, it was direct, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, so I think those are issues that we're seeing that are directed to us from the health, and then the police are left in the communities to deal with these issues. So it's something, as people know, like for me, it's a huge issue that we don't get the stats from how many people are even using their facilities, yet the whole community is subject to what we're seeing on Wesley Street based on overdose prevention sites, which are now making a hostage of communities. We're looking at like a medical clinic is moving, the Franklin Street Dental Clinic is losing customers, the pediatrician is, they're all looking at, do we move? And is that something we want to look at? So I think it's something we really need to have some really good discussions around and get some input from VHA and other professionals in the area when we look at these, when they come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I feel like we're, again, talking a lot about enforcement, and I had a very different impression about what today was going to be about, so I just want to echo, I agree with all the points said, but I feel like we're having the same conversation over and over, just with updated information. So I just wanted to very wholesomely and fulsomely support the idea of sitting down, talking about where council stands on these, and developing an advocacy strategy, because we're having the conversations at this table is great, but if we're not directing pressure to folks that it needs to be directed to and speaking up on behalf of the community, we're not really doing anything. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Gesselbrat.
Thank you. Just another point, you know, just building off of what Councillor Armstrong is speaking about, and also, you know, there was a movement of the harm reduction policy around drug use, and that, you know, the overdose protection sites fallen from that, and I'm curious where the conversation is at, as, you know, after 10 years of these policies, is it achieving the outcomes? Because I do hear folks on the health side advocate extremely strongly for these situations, and it's backed up by data in a lot of cases, but there's a growing tension between public safety and this harm reduction approach, and I think it's an unnecessary point of conflict, because I think ultimately people want the same things, and I'm just curious where the dialogue is on that, and is there new information coming out that these strategies that, you know, where we were advocating for certain types of harm reduction are actually exacerbating the problem as a policy that is increasing usage and social disorder, or is it just the only thing left that we can do amid all these other levels of social issues at the provincial and federal level, and it's like, it's unfortunately the only tool that's left, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Gesselbrock. There's no doubt that we're in a humanitarian crisis with the opioid crisis that we have in our community, and we definitely need robust health responses, and the OPS idea is just one, but it seems that it's not the panacea for everything that occurs on the street, not the least of which because the OPS only provides services for people that are using intravenous drugs and not those that inhale, for instance, which is a great number of folks that are on the street, notwithstanding that we see many folks that are still using intravenous drugs on Wesley Street. But yes, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should ever abandon any of the proven strategies, but if you're going to bring in things like OPSs, then they have to be managed responsibly, and that we have to look at the disorders and behaviors that occur outside, and, you know, all agree to own those solutions and address them, and I just don't think that that's happening right now.
So, can I follow up on that question quickly? So am I hearing, like, say for example, if you have an OPS or whatever, a large determinant on whether it becomes sort of a point of of expansion is dependent on how it's being managed, and if there's more thought into the design and the management of it in a lot more collaborative manner with the community and folks that are involved in public safety, you can have a better outcome. Or is it just not a good idea right from the outset and a strategy that we need to start avoiding?
Well, through the chair, I think what I'm trying to say is the OPS as we have it now has a limited scope of service. Just it's limited by its size, the fact that it can't support people that are inhaling, for instance. So it leaves a lot of people that are excluded from the scope of the service that they're providing. I think Ms. Bhopal Singh will speak after me and can speak more to the point of the OPS and what it would look like if it became a supervised consumption site licensed by the federal government. My understanding is that having that designation won't bring any additional money or services to that site, is my understanding, but I'll let Ms. Bhopal Singh confirm that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. If we had 400 more supportive housing units and therefore less people on the streets, would this situation downtown get better?
Through the chair, I believe it would be better, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I see no further questions.
Madam Chair, it's just an observation about the conversation. We've got two sort of things going on. One about the systemic issues around health and mental health and drugs and all that type of thing. And the second was the public safety issues around Wesley Street and some of these other, which was the side of this that we were intending to bring forward to you today. The Health and Housing Task Force is looking for into this, but even in discussing this with the police, there seemed to be substantial overlap between public safety and health and housing. So just wanted to note that we're kind of drifting into that realm, and I think the advocacy is being developed, hopefully through the Health and Housing Task Force, that have an informed advocacy as to what the province or others should be doing, because somebody should do something is sort of the label that everybody's out there, but what's effective. And I'm just noting on that last comment that it just seems through the conversations that I've heard at the Health and Housing Task Force, the ramping up of the housing piece over the last 2 years with this government has been substantial, but the corollary ramping up of the health piece to match that hasn't necessarily been there. And so you can have a lot of housing, but if you're only getting 2 hours of violent health service at our facilities now, that's not necessarily a recipe for a solution. That's just kind of changing the format a little bit. So I think you're demonstrating there's a significant overlap between public safety and Health and Housing Task Force, but today we are primarily focused on the public safety side, and we still have 2 more presentations to go, which is getting us even further into the health and housing side of it. So it's interesting with the police and bylaws being here, that's where the conversation also ended up.
Thank you. So I think at this time, have you completed, Mr. LaBerge?
Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's Lisa Bhopal Singh. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. So today I'm going to cover 3 pieces and really focus on what the city is doing, but I'd like to, before we talk about what we're doing in terms of community planning, acknowledge that for many of the things we're talking about, there are also many nonprofits who are part of the resilience side of some of the topics I'll be speaking of. So first of all, in terms of the reality for community planning, what we're seeing is increased numbers of people with complex health and housing needs, and this relates to what you're hearing from the RCMP and others today. And when it comes to health and housing, we're certainly seeing and hearing evidence that those who might previously have been housed in supportive housing are not able to maintain that housing because of the intensity of their health needs. And this is in part linked to both mental health and also the opioid crisis. Sometimes they intersect, sometimes they're separate. The other reality is that this has resulted in part, for safety implications for community members who are housed. And again, I think the RCMP emphasized that not all of those who are homeless or engaged in street activities are the cause of crime, and that's a really important point. But the reality is we have seen a shift in the impacts in our community resulting from crime for those who are housed. And then I'd also like to emphasize that community members who remain unhoused also are very vulnerable on our streets. And the RCMP and others have known that for some time. You've heard from Crown Council about certain groups in our community who are particularly vulnerable. So women, children, elderly people, LGBTQ who find themselves on the street are vulnerable in a different way, particularly from violence and physical crime. So what is the city's response to this from a planning perspective? And I think our CAO has just mentioned the Health and Housing Task Force and how that intersects with some of the conversations we're having today. So partnerships are a really key part to our response to this. The city is very aware that we have a role to play in this, but we have a role in conjunction with others, and the partnerships are critical. So the Health and Housing Task Force, led by Council, some of you who are more involved with it, will know that a key part of what's coming out of that is the direction to undertake systems mapping. And one of the pieces around that is an identification of who's doing what in our community, what are the needs in our community from a health, housing, and other social needs, and what are the gaps. And that's a key part to what Councillor Gesselbart was talking about in terms of lobbying and advocating. So we have a good sense of what's going on in our community, who's doing what, what's the difference between the capacity to meet those needs. This project will give us a clearer understanding of what we need to lobby more strongly for. We are also involved with the Nanaimo Homelessness Coalition that has been ongoing for many years, and bringing forward and supporting some of the initiatives that have come out of the Action Plan to End Homelessness. We are also participating in the Community Action Team, which is funded by the Overdose Emergency Response section of the ministry, and seeing what we can do to support helping those who are in crisis as a result of addictions. The other piece that our council has done, and I think Councillor Gasbrock and others have mentioned it, is the role of council in lobbying at UBCM and other forums that has already been ongoing with both the provincial and federal government around housing and health. So that's another piece that we have been undertaking as a community and a council. The other responses we've had is in terms of funding, resulting in part from the crisis we saw around Tent City. We have funded things like shower programs for those who are without shelter, urban cleanups, including hiring the John Howard and others to deal with some of the, I guess, community safety around cleanliness and sanitation. And then in the past, prior to BC Housing funding a year-round shelter at the Unitarian, the city did fund additional beds during the cold winter months outside of what would be called extreme shelters. So then I'm going to spend a few minutes and the rest of our time talking about not just a response, but what we're also doing. I'm having trouble. Can somebody help with the clicker? Oh, there we go. Around resiliency. And some of the things I'm talking about are things that we do as part of planning and have done for many years. So for example, looking at resiliency by design. So in terms of a safe environment and people's both perceptions and also experiences around safety, the built environment is very important. Many of you may be familiar with the term healthy built environments. Well, as part of our current planning on our development services and even long-range planning, looking at human-scale development, creating safe interactive spaces, livable streets, undoing some of the car-centric designs and maybe some of the development of the 1960s to 80s where the focus on community interaction on the streets is a really key piece. Mr. LaBerge talked about CPTED, or crime prevention through environmental design. These are all things that are embedded in the daily routine activities of development as they come through the city. And I think this is a really important ongoing piece. And what you'll see is images up there of programming and use of streets in alternative ways. So the street market, other festivals that take place downtown, and that ownership of civic and community space. Then we're going to talk about resiliency by connection. And this is a really important piece. How people feel about their neighborhoods and communities are often tied to how connected they feel to their neighbors, to their community, how involved they feel in decisions that impact them. So what you've got here are different aspects of diversity and inclusion that we get involved with supporting as part of planning. Council endorsed and supported an age-friendly plan. There are many elements of that that relate to safety for seniors, both physical safety in terms of navigating streets, and also connection and isolation and other pieces of safety. Youth engagement, another critical resilience piece. So as we look at the city both dealing with what I would call the crisis end, people who have fallen into a state where we need to support them in a crisis response either through RCMP, bylaws, and other interventions through health and housing, what can we do to stop and build resilience so that we're not continually feeding a cycle of people who end up on the streets. So youth engagement becomes an important one. Through our Parks and Rec, there's a partnership with the school district around the Youth Wellness Hub at the Aquatic Center. These are all important pieces. Council recently provided a letter of support to the Foundry Project, another key piece. We are also engaged in a regional childcare study, which is all about looking at assessing childcare needs and higher quality childcare across the region. These are all pieces that build resiliency, and some of you may have heard the term social determinants of health. These are all critical pieces when you're looking at building a healthier community and resolving some of the challenges that we see. Arts, culture, and recreation, those aspects of our department of the city play an important role. Recreation does a number of programming for youth that keep them connected and engaged in healthy activities. They also do work with seniors, and then also through planning, we do similar. And when you look at recreation, arts, and culture, and some of the lessons we might learn from our Indigenous communities, is a trauma-informed practice that looks at how people feel connected to their community and less isolated, is both preventative from those who are vulnerable to mental health challenges and those who might otherwise slip into engaging in activities like gangs or crime. Truth and reconciliation, there's another important piece here around the missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry that includes not only the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but calls to justice. So looking at inequity around who in our community experiences more crime based on their gender, based on their background. Crown Council mentioned the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous women, children, and those who are other genders like LGBTQ. So again, the city through its different actions is looking at what we can do to support better equity and inclusion. Participation in planning. This is a piece where community members have the opportunity to connect with each other and give influence to things that impact them in their environment. Transportation mobility planning, the same, and other forms of planning and opportunities for the community to get engaged in and provide input to are really important to a sense of well-being and for communities to feel connected. We also support the work of the Neighborhood Network. We do get engaged in neighborhood planning through that, but we also support the neighborhood networks as they come together. And again, people feel safer in communities where they feel connected to their neighbors and where they feel that their neighbors will help them. And so that's a really important piece when we look at planning and facilitating conversations. So I think that might be my last slide. Yes, it is. So with that, are there any questions?
Any questions? Not at this time? Oh, sorry. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair, through you. I don't think I do have a question, but I just wanted to make a comment at this point before we move on. I've said more than once that, in my opinion, public safety should be Council's first priority for our citizens, and I don't know if everybody agrees with that, but probably many would. This afternoon has been somewhat depressing as we hear about all the challenges that we have in our city, and we're right to face those and hear about them and talk about them. But I think what I'm coming away with is this, that the police are doing what they can with their resources. Our bylaws are doing what they can with their resources. Our community department is doing what you can with your resources, as is the fire department and our Parks and Recreation department, as we'll hear shortly. We're aware of all these problems and these issues. There are, of course, no easy solutions, but we're working on them. We're trying to do what we can. And if listeners come away with nothing else from that this afternoon, then I think that's important. We're not ignoring the problems. We're dealing with them through the Health and Housing Task Force and many other venues and channels, and we're doing our best to look for solutions. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Thorpe. Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. So a question I have is on the last item, neighborhood network. I have to admit I've never heard that.
Okay, so we of course we have various areas of the city that are organized into their own neighborhoods. And as part of that, we provide meeting space and attend meetings for the different groups that represent those neighborhoods. And so, and sometimes individual neighborhoods have questions about different planning processes, and we attend their meetings to answer questions. And so that's the neighborhood network. It's been established for several years. I don't know the exact number. And Chris Schulberg, who is our Heritage and Neighborhood Planner, helps facilitate that. And not all areas of the city are organized into neighborhood groups. Yeah.
So basically, it's neighborhood associations?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see no further questions, so I thank you so much for your presentation.
Madam Chair and Council. So you've seen me stand before you several times in the last month and talk about all the things that the fire department's doing in public safety. So I'm not going to take too much of your time. Dale says I have 15 seconds, so we'll see how. He's a slave driver, and to give Ms. Williams an opportunity to speak before you here today. So again, public safety isn't just about responding to calls. A lot of it is about prevention and education, and how we can mitigate and prepare our community as best we can. So in reality, 600 cardiac arrests, and of those, even this year, we've arrived on scene at 38 incidents where people were performing bystander CPR, and we had 332 people trained. Now we're at 341. Congratulations. A little bit of reality. There is an opioid crisis. It's real. We see it every day. We have gone or responded to over 1,200 incidents as firefighters since 2017, and we've administered 158 naloxone doses. And again, many of these occur in private residence, so it's not just on the streets. And how are we being resilient and moving forward with this? We're continuing to train our firefighters to prepare and administer naloxone, and we support mental health for compassion fatigue with our firefighters, as well as support it in the community as much as we can. Smoke alarms save lives. I'm hoping that fire we just responded to had a working smoke alarm. And public education works. So far this year, we've responded to 117 responses. This was up to about 4 days ago, whenever we put the slides together. And again, we've almost completed our smoke alarm program. We visited 665 mobile homes, and we've installed 200 smoke alarms to date this year.
We have a question. Mayor Crow.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the report, Chief. I'm just curious to know if you can comment at all. You've responded to over 1,200 overdoses, administered naloxone doses 158 times. Do you happen to have statistics or any information that might illuminate whether or not those are all individual cases, the 158, or is it somebody who's had it 2 or 3 times, or comment on whether we have what I will refer to rather unkindly as frequent flyers?
through the chair to Mayor Krog, many are frequent flyers, and that's where we get a lot of the compassion fatigue. A lot of times, a lot of the people on our streets we're responding to several times within a month or a few weeks. Again, a lot of the individuals in homes are single individuals where we might not go back to again, but a lot of, from anecdotal reports from our crews, a lot of them are the same individuals. And what we do know is every time somebody overdoses, it affects their mental capacity as well. So if they become, have a brain injury, the more times that they've gone without oxygen and respirations into their brain function.
Thank you.
Okay.
And, excuse me, Councillor Turley.
Chair, a question with regard to, I understand the smoke alarms, but does the fire department have any recommendation with regard to fire extinguishers?
Through the chair to Councillor Turley, well, of course, every home should have a fire extinguisher in it, but the primary response is keeping yourself safe. So your primary responsibility is protecting lives, so about getting out. We would prefer people not to use a fire extinguisher if they're going to become injured themselves. We do not process fire extinguishers, but by code, every business and public building in our city is required to have fire extinguishers. I have one in my house. Thank goodness I've never had to use it, but they're pretty simple to use as well. So,
Thank you.
Oh.
yeah.
Nobody?
Okay, and last
Keep on
slide for
going.
you. Last slide. So one of the things we know is that the perception is safe. The perception of safety becomes reality. So if people perceive that they're safe, they feel safer. It becomes their reality. If there's a perception that they're unsafe, that also relates through, and that's public safety incidents. So our firefighters now, more than any other years, you'll see them out in the community more. We've participated in 150 years so far this year, our events this year, which include park events, Camp Courage, VIX, a plethora of events with over 3,600 community members. So we're tracking all of our community engagements out in the community. And what that does, it builds, creates a safety net where whether it's perceived or real, and if our firefighters are on the street and they're down on Wesley Street or they're down on Commercial Street, it gives people a sense of security knowing that a uniform is a uniform. And I do expect that they would stand up and step in if needed. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Chief Fry.
Oh.
And last but never least.
What a heavy day. I'm Liz Williams, Parks and Recreation. So I'm here to talk to you about the reality for Parks and Recreation, and specifically around our facilities and our parks. And you've heard all of this, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We've seen an increase in discarded needles, drug paraphernalia, increase in encampments in our parks, increase in vandalism, increase in theft, increase in loitering and sleeping in our recreation facilities, an increase in negative interactions with our users and disadvantaged residents, and an increase in illegal drug use in and around our facilities. That's the bad news. So out of this has been building for a while. In 2006, we introduced a needle box program in our parks and facilities. So that was to try and reduce the needles from being left around, which we have seen an uptake in the use of those, so that's a good thing, better there than in the park. We updated our bylaw, as my colleague Mr. LeBurge spoke to, so that's been very helpful. We've had a timely response to cleanups and getting there's sometimes the garbage left behind from encampments or people just spending the night, so that's been good. We've increased staffing in order to deal with some of the cleanups and the needle pickups. We've added security to Bevan Park and other areas of concern. And we've improved the lighting in some of our targeted areas where we've had theft. We've reduced, unfortunately, some access to areas in our building. So an example of that would be the Portland Loo, where it's not open 24 hours anymore. We've had to restrict some of the hours just because of cleanup in that area and/or public safety to our staff and the public. Other areas where we've reduced some access to washrooms is at Bowen Park. We've had to reduce some hours there, but it's still open when we can monitor those facilities. We've also had reviewed and changed some of the access points to our facilities, so we're putting admission gates we're looking into putting admission gates at Bevan Pool, so people can't flow in and out as easily. We're also looking at Nanaimo Aquatic Center in the same way. And resiliency. So this is where we try and build on the negatives a little bit and make it we've been able to give additional training to our staff in dealing with negative interactions. So Councillor Armstrong was involved in that at some point. And we also have brought in Mr. LeBurge to help out with some dealing with difficult people. We've improved safety equipment for our staff working in parks for picking up some of the paraphernalia they've been picking up. We've offered staff training around bloodborne pathogens, naloxone training, disposal of drug paraphernalia, and opioid awareness. If you'd asked me 10 years ago if we would have been doing that, I probably would have said no, but we have been. Develop better communication with other agencies. So I would compliment my coworkers in fire and safety, RCMP, bylaw, and social planning. The communication between those departments has been great and very helpful when we're dealing with situations where we're not experts on that matter. So that's been very helpful for us. We've been looking at lifting tree canopies and cleaning the underbrush in certain areas. So Maffeo Sutton Park, you would notice we've been lifting that, kind of deterring the overnight stays in areas. So that has been happening at Maffeo Sutton, Bevan Park. I'm gonna miss a few. Anyway, and also getting rid of that fire load that tends to build up under those tree areas. And educating staff and reducing the opportunity for theft. So in the same way the RCMP do a campaign at Christmas time saying don't leave the packages in your car, we've been reminding staff that if an area in a building isn't being used, then please lock it up until the public are there. Or even it's something as simple as we have a lot of seniors that hang out in the lobby at Bowen Park, reminding them to take their purses or their jackets with them when they wander off to use the washroom or things like that. Just reducing the opportunity for things to go missing. And to Councillor Hemmond's point, a busy facility is a facility that reduces that chance for people to loiter around and interact for that negative behavior. So the busier we can keep our facilities, the less those opopportunities are there for them.
Question from Councillor.
I can wait till the end of the presentation.
Okay, wait until the end. Okay, thank you.
Also, it gives us an opportunity to review some of the existing procedures we have, so a hold and secure and lockdown procedures. So similar to the school district where they have procedures, and I'll give you an example of a hold and secure. We had at Oliver Woods, we had a cougar spotted in the neighborhood. So that's an incident where we would use the hold and secure procedure for the people that were in our Oliver Woods area. They did stick around. So, yeah, that's where we're at with Parks and Recreation. And to my coworker, Lisa Paulsing's point, the youth hub, and we're moving our youth coordinator down to NAC, which is a very busy location, has a lot of students and youth in that location. We're trying to up our game by making our youth coordinator a bit more visible to the youth. We also have, out of Public Works, our green team is starting up to help with that illegal dumping and helping to clean up our community. There you go. I went really fast, so you guys could go home.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Ms. Williams. The one thing, first of all, I'd like to compliment Parks and Rec and Mr. Harding with regard to the covered lacrosse box in Harewood. The challenge that we were running into during the past lacrosse season was, shall we say, undesirable use of the floor when it wasn't being used for sporting events. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that now it's fairly securely locked. And if that's the case, does that reduce the amount of undesirable activity, I guess?
It does. We've also shifted how we use our staffing. So our two picnic shelters that we have in Bowen Park, and then the outdoor covered sport box. Those are areas where we have staff start their day, or they have the allocation sheet, so we know when people are going to be using the boxes and the shelters. So we have staff loop through there first to clean up and or remind people to move along.
Okay, perfect.
So it's helped, but I think there's been a bit of vandalism in that area as well. So we try and clean up the graffiti as quickly as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Krog.
Thank you very much. I had the opportunity to meet with the parks and staff, facility staff, some months ago at the Rotary Clubhouse, and at that time it was certainly indicated to me that there was a great deal of staff time being spent essentially cleaning up the needles and dealing with the garbage that's left and all of the things that arise out of people camping in the parks and so on. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on whether it's getting worse, it's getting better, it's the same, and also how much of the budget, so to speak, for all those hardworking people who have to deal with this every day are we spending dealing with what essentially amounts to a housing, opioid, drug, mental health, etc. crisis that we're, as Councillor Thorpe said, a bit depressed about hearing today?
So we have had, we are definitely over budget in the cost center where staff are used to go up and clean up the encampments. And we're at $312,000 to date. In cleanup, the budget was around 150. So we're over budget.
162,000, if my math is correct.
Sorry?
162,000. Did you say 150?
Don't quote me on the exact numbers there, but yes, we are definitely significantly over budget in that area for cleanup.
Thank you. Councillor Gusabra.
Thank you, Chair. Through you. Just question on needle disposal. We've installed more boxes over the last year or so for that?
When we have problem areas, we'll install more. We have 42 boxes in the city right now.
Great.
Yeah.
I was walking down the road, and I used to work at the prison, so I know a lot of the folks that are sort of living in that lifestyle, and somebody that I knew recognized me while I was walking the road. I was like, "Hey, I heard you're on council now. Do you know what you need more of?" And he was like talking about these like tubes where they have different areas where you can put the needles in top. But him and the person they're with was like, those would be used a lot more if there was a bunch more around. So I don't know if there is problem areas. I haven't seen that design around at all, but I thought that I'd pass it along. And the other comment I wanted to make was this addiction, homelessness crisis, it has been a big burden on the community, and I'm quite moved just hearing just the collaboration between different departments and how everybody's really doing the most that we can to shoulder this, and it's pretty impressive just to sort of see the level of collaboration, and people are holding their heads high through this, and so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We are at the end of our meeting. It is now 4:20. Yes, Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just maybe to wrap up our presentation, first of all, I just wanted to thank Council for your time this afternoon. I know you've had a long day, and I think we were kind of originally hoping to end early and give you some time for discussion, but I think what happened today was you were able to have some of that discussion throughout the presentation, so hopefully there was some benefit from that. And before we wrap, I'd also just want to thank all the people who participated, the team who participated in putting today together, because it was both staff and outside agencies that came together to deliver today. So I wanted to pass on my thanks.
Very well said, Mr. Lindsay. And I'm just going to say my 2 cents, is that I truly believe that the addiction and mental health is all wrapped into health. Unfortunately, the health has also created a criminal element to it. So I'm happy to see that we're very strong at recognizing what is happening in our community, what our issues are, and how hard we're trying to work on making improvements for public safety for all our citizens. So thank you, everybody, for today. Motion to adjourn? Oh, what else is there on the agenda? Oh, agenda planning. Did anyone wish to speak to agenda planning? Oh, Sky.
Yes, I just wanted to let Mayor and Council know it's provided for information, and we have the next few meetings scheduled until the beginning of January.
Thank you. No questions?
Madam Chair, if I could clarify the broader conversation around agenda planning, it might be helpful because there's been finance today, there's been, if I may just comment on that. So next Monday is another special finance and audit committee. I believe it's starting at noon or early afternoon now. It will take us to then our evening schedule of meetings. The following week on the 9th, I believe there's going to be another GPC in the afternoon. And there's a series of smaller topics, easier in the head, I think. And then the 16th is the regular council meeting, which would be your last regular council meeting of the year. We're also talking about the 2nd next week, so I've skipped over the evening meeting next week. So we have 2 formal council meetings, as well as some other meetings throughout the month. We are currently scheduled to have your first GPC of next year, the first Monday of the year, though that's still under discussion. If that material can be put together, that would be for arts and culture. And then moving into the agenda for next year. So we're already into the planning stage. So I thought at one of our previous meetings, we indicated that you'll be given time, maybe when you've got more time, to do some agenda planning for the new year. And that was our intent, to bring that to you in January for the future GPCs.
Thank you. And any questions from the public? Thank you. Now I can ask for a motion to adjourn. So moved by Councillor Bonner, seconded by Councillor Kesselbrock. All those in favor? No, I want to stay. No.